On November 1st, 1955, United Airlines Flight 629 exploded shortly after takeoff from Denver, ending the lives of all 44 on board. As investigators sifted through the wreckage, a chilling truth emerged. The blast had come from within. And at the center of this mystery, an unassuming suitcase, a grieving son, and a deadly plan masked as tragedy. Listen to the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. About 10 years ago now, my dad passed away. He died of natural causes, but it was so sudden that it hit us really hard. And then maybe a month or so after all the funeral and inheritance stuff, I got asked if I wanted a few boxes of his things. My mom and dad divorced when me and my little sister were kids, and he lived on the other side of the state, so we only ever saw him on weekends and only ever if he was free. He was a big workaholic and didn't have much time for us growing up, so when it came time to divide up the boxes of his stuff, she told me that I was welcome to all three. I took delivery of the 3 cardboard boxes a couple of days later, and then for about a week, they sat untouched in my living room. Now, opening them meant accepting that he was gone and that he was never coming back. And while that might sound kinda obvious since I already attended his funeral and received my inheritance, I guess that's just where I was at emotionally. I took a couple of days before I finally summoned up the courage to cut the tape and open up the boxes, and when I did, it was just as emotional as I imagined it would be. All the stuff from his childhood, seeing how similar we were growing up, it really gave me this concrete sense of who I was and where I'd come from. There were all kinds of baseball cards, old photos of my dad and my aunt as kids, and an old Fender Stratocaster, still in its case, which had to be worth thousands of dollars by this point. And there was a really nice shirt too, one from an expensive tailor in New York. And then finally, there was the laptop case. And by the look of things, it had to be from the mid-90s at the very least, but then large sections of it were made from what appeared to be real leather, and it was actually really well designed in terms of all the extra storage and how ergonomic it was. I decided to get it refurbished, if that's even the right word for stuff like that, and then I could use it for my laptop, for folders and files, and it had looked damn good holding them too. But first, I needed to make sure all the little pockets and pouches were empty. There were some receipts in one pouch, some old Italian lira in another, which is the money they used to use before euros, and then in another pouch, I found an envelope. But the name written on it wasn't my dad's. It wasn't even really a name at all. It just said, Honey. And at first I figured it was a letter from my mom, one from before the divorce when they were still in their honeymoon period. Now, I thought it might make for a nice read, something to remind me that they were actually in love once. But then when I opened the envelope, I saw some pictures inside it too. Nude pictures. And having already retrieved the handwritten letter and assuming the photos were of my mom, I dropped the envelope with the photo still inside like it was radioactive. Now, I was kind of put off reading the letter too, because if there were nude pictures in the envelope, then I'd most likely be grossed out to all hell by its contents. But I figured as soon as it got spicy, I'd just tap out and then burn the envelope's contents, because God knows that I didn't want anyone getting their hands on those pictures. Now anyway, I started reading the letter, and right away I'm feeling suspicious, because it's not my mom's handwriting. I was suspicious, not overly so because, and cool story, people's handwriting actually changes over time due to things like health, experience, mood, and intentional practice. I did a whole semester on neurological stuff like that in college, so with that in mind, I didn't immediately think, this isn't a letter from my mom. Another reason it didn't occur to me that it wasn't her letter was the date. It was dated at a time when they were still married, but then as I read the letter's contents, none of it made any sense. It talked about places my dad and the author had been, but to my knowledge, Mom and Dad had never been to California together, and if they had, I was pretty sure that they'd have mentioned it in passing at some point, not just kept it a secret. And like I said, I got maybe halfway through the letter before I sort of said, okay, this is definitely not Mom, because the author was calling my dad all these pet names that were not the same ones used by my mother. Now, I remember picking up the envelope and rolling the dice by taking a look at the pictures. Then lo and behold, the naked lady in them was definitely not my mom. meaning only one thing. My dad, prior to the divorce, had been cheating on my mom with a lady that he met at work. And if my suspicions were correct, that was what led to the divorce, not the irreconcilable differences they cited in the divorce papers. And the only thing that I didn't understand was why my mom would keep it a big secret. She wasn't exactly Dad's biggest fan after the divorce, and she really didn't hold back from talking trash about him. But if that was the case, and assuming that she knew about it, then why didn't she mention the affair? The only explanation was either she wanted to protect us from the truth, which seemed very unlikely, or she genuinely didn't know my dad had an affair. If that was the case, and call me selfish or whatever you want, but I did not want to be the one to tell her. They say ignorance is bliss, and I can tell you from experience just how true that really is. So while I understand people thinking I should have told her, I chose not to. What I chose to do instead was use Google to try and dig up any information on her I could find. The lady signed off her love letter with a shortened version of a fairly common girl's name, so I tried plugging that name, along with a company my dad used to work at, into the search bar, and then tried adding specific fields like accounting or human resources, and actually got a couple of hits. But there weren't many company pages in my results. They were just sort of news articles, details how a lady who had worked at the same company as my dad had gone missing during the early 90s. Now, I didn't know the lady's second name, so I couldn't be 100% sure that she was the same one my dad had the affair with, but after finding an article which had a picture of her, there was no longer any doubt. The lady who went missing in the 90s was the same one in those nudie pictures. I had to know more, and so I called Mom with what I knew was a very strange request. I wanted to ask her something about Dad, but she wasn't allowed to ask any follow-up questions, not until I was sure of something. Luckily, she wasn't interested in hearing anything I discovered, so I got off lightly in that respect, and so I asked her my question. I wanted to know what was going on with her and Dad around the time his affair partner went missing. Now, I didn't say anything about the affair. I just told her the date in question and then asked if she could remember anything unusual happening with him around that time. And at first, she basically said, "You're asking me for details from more than 20 years ago. I can barely remember what happened last week." And I asked her to think on it for me, and then call me back if she remembered anything. She said okay, and then a couple of days later, she gave me a call. Now, for a woman that had once said that she didn't want to know anything I'd found out, Mom seemed really focused on asking me why I asked her that question. I reiterated that I didn't want to tell her until I knew more about the situation because at that stage, it amounted to nothing but speculation. I didn't want to worry or frighten anyone because when all was said and done, the situation might not be as bad as I feared. She reluctantly accepted, just as long as I promised to tell her when the case was closed, so to speak. After racking her brain about it, Mom began to claw back some memory of the period in question. She remembered how Dad was working a lot and how something at his job seemed to be getting him down. He seemed to get more and more stressed about it, losing sleep and not eating properly, and then one day he announced that he was headed for an impromptu hiking vacation to de-stress. Mom said he wasn't much of a hiker, and it had been organized as a team-building/de-stressing exercise by the company, so he pretty much had to attend. He seemed happy about it, as much as he could be given the status of his mind, and that he was gone for about 3 or 4 days before he came home again. Mom said that she thought that he'd show signs of improvement on his return, but apparently, Dad was worse than ever. He slept for like an entire day after he got home, seemed moody and distant for a few days, and then only basically got back to his regular self after weeks of supposedly taking it easy at work. My mom said that since she'd been thinking about it, she realized that that was the beginning of the end of their marriage. Dad was never the same again, and she filed for divorce just over a year later, after trying to work things out with him. She said that she was very interested to know what I'd found, which, again, stood in stark contrast to how she'd acted a few days before. And then when I asked her if she was sure, really sure, she said yes, before asking in a very concerned voice, "What the heck have you found?" I told her I had a few more loose ends to tie up, but then I'd give her the full breakdown of what I'd found. But I warned her it'd be upsetting at best and terrifying at worst. Now, she sounded just as scared as I was when she said okay, and then after we'd hung up, I put together a little plan of action for the following morning. I was going to call the cops, tell them I had some information regarding a missing persons case from the early 90s, and then hand over the love letter connecting the missing lady to my dad. I told them all about what my mom had said too, how Dad had been acting weird around the time the lady disappeared. But I don't think that helped much. They needed hard evidence, not the anecdotal kind. It was probably the single most surreal, heartbreaking, and depressing thing I've ever done. Report my own father for potentially being a murderer. But if it had helped solve this poor lady's case, who probably had family out there hoping she was alive, then I kind of had to, didn't I? It didn't come to anything, like my dad was never announced as a suspect or anything like that, and aside from the report I gave, the cop only called back once to confirm a few details that weren't in my statement and then never called again. That part was easy, but telling my mom about the affair and how the lady had gone missing while Dad was acting weird, that part was anything but. It was one thing to find out that he'd been cheating on her, but considering the possibility he'd been involved in this lady's disappearance was another thing entirely, and I watched her sink into this pit of depression for a while. It didn't matter if he was involved in her disappearance. It was having this whole secret life that she didn't know about, grieving some lover that she'd lost in secret, and that was the best case scenario because, in the worst, she'd been sharing her bed with a goddamned murderer for like a year after. And now I just live with this all in my head. It doesn't even mean that Dad didn't murder that girl yet. It just means the cops haven't been able to prove it conclusively, and that's my biggest fear. That one day, I'll get a call saying that I helped solve the murder that my own damned father committed and kept secret. What feels like a long time ago now, I went to stay with some relatives over the holidays. Late on Christmas Day, the party was winding down, and I was sitting with my uncle and a few others while we finished off a bottle or two. My aunt and uncle decorated their kitchen almost entirely with pictures of themselves and my cousins, so we spent quite a while looking at each of them and either reminiscing or harmlessly poking fun. I remember we were laughing at one picture because my uncle's 70s hair was absolutely hilarious. Then, as he took it all in good humor, he got up and said something like, "If you think that's funny, wait until you see Aunt Janny's hair from the 80s. She thought she was Grace Jones." Now we're thinking no way, and my aunt tells him that he's a dead man if he brings those photo albums down from their bedroom. But my uncle didn't listen, and somehow he lived to see another day. Aunt Janie's hair was cool as heck, by the way, and then since my uncle brought down a whole box full of photo albums for us to flick through, we started passing them around. I found myself flicking through this one album that contained much older photos than the others. And then in one photo, a man I first mistook for my Uncle Steve, whose home I was staying at, was standing in a church while wearing some kind of ceremonial Catholic robe. Now don't laugh at me, I don't know the names of those things, but admittedly I was pretty drunk, so the first thing out of my mouth was like, "Holy crap, Uncle Steve, when the heck were you a priest?" Now he was pretty drunk too, so for a second he says, "I've never been..." And then he shot me this look like he'd just done something he shouldn't. Then, and he wasn't mean or aggressive about it, but he quickly took the album away, saying, "I think we've seen enough from this one." Now I'm wondering why he's all embarrassed about it, but when Aunt Janie realized what was happening, she immediately rose from her seat, took the album, and returned it upstairs. And when she returned, I asked her what the deal was and why she seemed so desperate to remove that particular album. She said that she didn't want to spoil the evening, so she'd tell me all about it in the morning. And the next morning, after a very hungover breakfast, I waited for an opportune moment to ask my Aunt Janie about the photo I saw. She sighed and said something like, "I've been hoping you've forgotten all about that." But she stayed true to her word, put on a pot of coffee, and started telling me the story. And so the first thing you need to know is that the man in the religious clothing was not my Uncle Steve. It was his non-identical twin, Simon. They still looked hella similar, but had apparently taken very different paths in life because Simon went off to join the seminary or whatever after college. Now, I thought it was odd that I was only just getting an introduction to him, but over the course of the next half hour or so, it made total sense why no one talked about him anymore. Now, after graduating from the seminary, now don't crucify me by the way, I don't know how it all works, my Uncle Simon ended up moving to Nebraska. He worked here on the East Coast for a while, but then was offered some big shot job working for the church way over in Lincoln, and so that's where he went. He stayed in Lincoln for around 10 years, and then one day, he forwarded Uncle Steve a new address and a phone number. Steve thinks he's been promoted or something, and so he calls to congratulate him. But Uncle Simon hadn't been promoted. He'd retired from the church, yet he wasn't some senior, he was in his mid-30s. Uncle Steve thought that Simon sounded weird on the phone, so he drove all the way out to see him at his new place to make sure that he was okay. Well, Uncle Simon was not okay. He was drinking a whole bunch and said that he lost his faith and had basically given up on the world. Uncle Steve figured that he was having some kind of early onset midlife crisis and stayed with him till he got his drinking under control. And then once he was on his feet again, Steve drove home and monitored his brother by phone instead. He called him one day, and then once every couple of days, and then once a week, and by the time the calls were a week, Simon was saying something about writing a book and trying to get it published. He had a bunch of savings from his work with the church, and since he was acting stable, Uncle Steve figured that Simon was over the worst of his midlife crisis. They kept in touch, just not on the regular, but then one day, Uncle Steve called his brother and found that he wasn't answering his phone. He got so worried that he drove out to Nebraska to check on him personally, but when he arrived, he found Simon had passed away in his sleep. Uncle Steve later said that finding his brother's body like that was the worst thing that ever happened to him, but since he was so focused on reporting the death to the cops and not compromising on what might have been a crime scene, he didn't take a detailed look around Simon's house, meaning he and his family had to wait about a week or two to get a full picture of what caused his death. And so the first thing that Uncle Steve found out was that Simon died from some kind of liver disease caused by his drinking. He'd apparently started up again in secret, and it all just caught up with him one day in the worst possible way. And then, once they were clear to collect his belongings, Steve found out why his brother had started drinking again, and that it's all to do with that book that he was writing. Now, this was back in the early 90s, so Simon had one of those electronic word processors to write with. Well, Steve ends up taking it home and asks it to print out what's stored on it, and it prints out everything Simon had written over the past couple of weeks. It turns out Simon's book was about his time in the church, but it read like a damned confession. Basically, the big high-profile job that he'd been given in Lincoln was essentially a public relations role, in that his job was to maintain good relations between the Catholic Church and the people of Nebraska. But this was a PR role unlike any other because the specifics involved visiting the families of children who had been abused by priests or whoever and convincing them not to take any legal action. And he did this by telling them the offending priests would be moved and also by offering them pretty measly amounts of cash, considering these kids would be scarred for life, obviously. If they didn't comply, he'd move on to threatening them with countersuits and whatnot, saying that it'd be much easier and much less costly for them to just move on. Now, you might think that that kind of thing only happens maybe once every few years or so, or if you're naive to the Catholic Church, that is. But for those that aren't, well, I'm guessing you're already wise to the fact that there were a lot of these cases for Uncle Simon to deal with. There was a time when he had one family a week, sometimes two if the schedule got a little congested, and he wasn't just confined in Nebraska either. He traveled to all the surrounding states, using either the carrot or the stick to convince these poor, victimized families to take the money and shut up for the good of the church. And the way they justified this, the church I mean, was absolutely nightmarish. First off, there was a running narrative among certain priests that the kids were responsible for tempting the clergy, and that the encounters in certain cases were very much consensual. Now, I can't even begin to wrap my head around the disgustingly perverted logic of that, and how someone could convince themselves that that was the case, but I can kind of understand the next group, who thought certain parents were just trying to get money out of the church. Uncle Simon wrote how certain people, himself included, didn't doubt that there were a handful of legitimate cases, but they also believed the Michael Jackson hypothesis, as they put it, that one legit case sparked dozens of fake ones, with each set of parents only looking for a payout. That one was a lot easier for people to believe, but then there were the priests who straight up believed all the cases were legitimate, but didn't care because to them, the overall benefits of the church outweighed the negatives of the abusing priests. Uncle Simon lasted in that job for 10 years, A whole decade of ensuring that evil didn't get punished. And then one day it just caught up with him, I guess. He'd been living in his messed up predatory echo chamber for so long that when he finally saw the light, it drove him nuts and turned him into a major alcoholic. I get it too. Like if one day you realized you'd been a total piece of crap, like legitimately enabling evil to exist in the world, what else is there to do but isolate yourself, drink yourself into a stupor, and just wait around to die? You failed at life in one of the worst ways possible, and I don't think people can come back from something like that. Once they found out what Simon really did for a living, the way my Uncle Steve dealt with it was just not talk about it. He didn't do therapy or anything like that. He just shut him away in a box somewhere in his mind and pretended he didn't even have a brother anymore. Simon was just some guy he happened to grow up with who no longer deserved any thought. I remember asking if Uncle Steve had maybe forgotten the picture was there or if he kept one last picture of his brother to remember him by. Aunt Janie said that it was definitely the latter. Steve knew that picture was in that album, and it wouldn't have mattered if he was blackout drunk. He wouldn't have brought it downstairs unless for some reason he wanted us to see it. We figured it might be a cry for help or something, and all that feeling was bubbling up after all those years. But to my knowledge, he never talked about it. I mean, maybe he did talk about it with my aunt and asked her not to broadcast what he said, but who knows? And I sure hope he did anyway, because it's not healthy to keep that kind of pain buried inside like that. Not healthy at all. So I can't be too generous with the details because this is obviously a very personal thing for both me and my immediate family. But to give you a bit of background, I grew up in the United Kingdom to a very moderate Muslim family. And by very moderate, I mean none of my sisters wear hijabs, the traditional hair covering. We own Christmas jumpers and have Christmas dinner, and I only go to mosque maybe once a year around Eid. Now, we pray 5 times a day, and we like praying together as a family when possible. And we also abstain from booze and bacon, and although my mom loves cooking Italian, and oh my god, she so wants to be Italian, she always uses halal meat. Now, I say all this to paint a picture of my family, and the same thing applies to my extended family too. And it's a member of that extended family that this story is all about. In September of last year, so 2024, me and my sister were reminiscing over Snapchat. We got talking about a party that we went to when I was 6 and she was 8, and how we fell out because I refused to wear a different colored dress than her. And then I remember laughing about how petty we were, when I had this weird kind of flashback and saw an older boy's face in some long dormant memory. Now, I did a quick mental inventory, counted all of our cousins in my head, and then realized that he was a spare. And by that I mean I couldn't quite remember if he was a relative or not. In the end, it was just me and my sister who group texted our mom to get her to settle it once and for all. But then, the strangest thing happened. We knew this boy was real. I mean, all our brothers and sisters remembered who we were talking about, but when we asked Mom, she denied all knowledge. We were texting her like, was he this auntie's son or that auntie's son, thinking that Mom's going to suddenly remember and say, oh yeah, I remember now. But she didn't. She just kept on saying that she didn't remember until it actually got kind of weird. Now, the next time I was home, I went through all the family albums trying to find a photo of the boy that I was talking about. And there were a lot of old photos of birthday parties, iftars, and Eid celebrations, but I didn't see the face of that older boy anywhere. It got to the point where I started to feel a bit mental, but I knew that I wasn't just imagining stuff, and so I ended up asking my dad if he remembered who I was talking about, and when I did, he started acting very, very cagey. Now, he got this almost frightened look about him, and then couldn't hide the nervousness in his voice when he said, "Have you asked your mom?" Now, he might as well have said that spy thing. You know the one. I can neither confirm nor deny the existence of blah blah blah, as basically an admission that blah blah exists or had happened, and so I knew something weird was going on when he too offered only a very cagey denial. Now, I might have uncovered some kind of family conspiracy, but I hadn't traveled all the way home for winter break just to play detective and annoy my parents. Now, I thought about it once or twice, and I spoke to my sister about it too, who agreed something weird was definitely going on. But it was only when Mom invited me to go through her books to see which ones I fancied taking back to uni that I accidentally blew the whole thing wide open. I was standing in front of Mom's bookcase, taking certain books down to read the blurbs on the back, and then after I pulled this larger hardcover out, I saw a photograph fall out from between the pages. It was a family photograph, like many others we had in the house, but then I saw him, that spare boy from my memory of the party, and I remember gasping when I saw his face. He looked a little bit younger than my memory, but it was definitely him, and I had finally had evidence of his existence right there in my hand. I found Mom in the kitchen, showed her the photo, and then asked her to please try and remember who he was. I didn't make any demands because I knew that she couldn't play dumb any longer, and I asked her why the photo was in the book, and then I just watched her sigh. Mom took the photo from me, told me we needed to talk in private, and took me upstairs to my bedroom. It was actually kind of a rush to have almost like uncovered a clue, you know? But whatever Mom was about to tell me did not seem like it was going to be good news. She told me the boy was an older cousin of mine, one who I'll just call Zach, and that he'd moved away to university when I was just starting primary school. But sadly, while he was there, something very tragic happened to him. Assuming there had been some kind of incident, I asked if Zach had passed away, but only felt even more confused when my mom said that we didn't know if he was with us or not. He was just missing. I understood why I hadn't been told until I needed to be told, but when I suggested going to visit my auntie to pay my respects and tell her I was sorry, Mom shook her head. I also understood that parents protect their kids from certain painful truths, but I didn't understand it one bit when Mom said that, and I'm using her words here, we don't talk about him anymore. I was very taken aback. A cousin of ours had disappeared while studying at uni, and we just didn't talk about him anymore? I thought that was absolutely outrageous, and I made a rare demand of my mom to tell me more. But all she'd said was that Zach had gone missing during his studies and that we hadn't heard from him since. And it was Mom's decision not to talk about him anymore, and the family respected that by not having any photos of him around or in any of the albums, because the last thing Mom and Dad wanted was to dredge up painful memories for her. Mom did hide that photo in the book. She never admitted it, but I knew it was because she couldn't bring herself to throw away every photo of Zach. All I wanted to know was why, but trying to get her to tell me only started a massive fight. We made up the next morning and everything was fine till I went back to uni after winter break. But when she dropped me off at the station, Mom warned me not to talk to my aunt about it. She understood I'd be curious, but she wasn't making it up when she said that my aunt wouldn't want to talk about it. She made me promise her that I wouldn't try it, and I did. I promised her. But God forgive me, it was a promise I didn't keep, and sometimes I think I'd do just about anything to be able to turn back the clock and properly honor that promise. The only clue Mom had given me regarding Zach's disappearance was the time of year that it occurred. I don't know if it was deliberate or if it just slipped out when she was describing how it happened, but she told me that Zach hadn't come home for winter break. And that's when it all started. Mid-December, so while I'd missed the anniversary of it by about 3 weeks, I knew my aunt still had it on her mind, in the way that people do have stuff on their minds when it comes to certain anniversaries. And so after getting dropped off at the station, I chose not to catch my train. I told myself I'd catch the next one, which was roughly 2 hours from then, and in the meantime, I'd go buy some flowers and drop them off at my aunt's house. Now, I couldn't bear to think of her and my uncle dealing with all that heartache alone, but I also couldn't be overt with my condolences. I decided that I'd just write, "I'm sorry, thinking of you in this difficult time," without signing my name, and then leave them on their doorstep before disappearing into the night. I brought the flowers, wrote the note, and then caught the bus to my aunt's housing estate. I had my scarf up over my face, and I had this new woolly hat on that neither my aunt or uncle would recognize, and I even tried writing the note in block capitals to try and throw them off. But then, as much as I felt good about myself in my attempt to comfort them, things took a drastic turn for the worse, and as quickly as that very next morning. Early that next morning, I got a call from my aunt, and the moment her name appeared on my phone screen, I thought, uh-oh. I answered the call, trying to sound innocent and apologize for not calling around to visit them while I had the chance. But then my auntie spoke, and I knew that I'd been found out somehow. She asked me, and very seriously I might add, if I'd left anything on her doorstep that previous evening. And since I couldn't lie to her, I just admitted to it and said, yes, I did. I was scared that she'd start screaming at me or something, or that she'd tell my mom and get her to do the shouting. But she didn't, and instead, my mom asked if I was free to chat for some time that week. And when it came time to the meeting, waiting for her to arrive was really nerve-wracking. I had a horrible feeling that it'd be a lot of, we're not angry, we're just disappointed type thing, which I'm sure that you all agree is way worse than parents just being angry with you. But when my aunt arrived, she seemed a lot more happy to see me than I thought she would be. She wasn't angry with me, she wasn't even disappointed. There was just something really important that I needed to know, and she wasn't going to enjoy telling me. And so after getting comfortable and making us cups of tea, my aunt asked me to fill her in on what I already knew. Now obviously, all I knew was that Zach had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But to her, the circumstances weren't mysterious at all. The issue wasn't so much that he'd vanished, it was that Zach had let my aunt know exactly where he was and exactly what he was doing. My aunt said that when he first went missing, Zach wasn't responding to any texts or calls. He was supposed to arrive home on a Friday evening in December, then when my aunt hadn't heard from him by about midnight, she called the police to tell them something was wrong. My aunt said that she had this terrible feeling that he'd had a car accident on an icy road and was dead in a ditch somewhere. But not even 24 hours passed before the police called her back to say that they'd found Zach's car in an airport car park. Now my aunt said that she went from relieved to worried again because Zach hadn't mentioned anything about flying anywhere. Then when she asked where he'd gone, the police told her he'd flown out of the UK on the same day that she reported him missing, and that he'd flown to Turkey. My aunt had next to no bloody clue what he'd flown to Turkey for. He wasn't the type to jet off on some lad's holiday without saying anything, and it wasn't like he'd have to conceal some romantic getaway with a girlfriend because they didn't mind if he dated responsibly. And the police said that they'd be in touch because they were in the process of reaching out to Turkish authorities. But between then and when they called her back, my auntie ended up mentioning the disappearance to a friend. Yet when she mentioned the word Turkey, her friend's face turned ashen. God bless her, but my auntie doesn't exactly keep up with the current events because she had to have had her friend fill her in on why Zach's trip to Turkey had alarmed her so much. She'd heard some stuff on the news about a terrorist group in the Middle East, but without trying to sound flippant, when has that not been the case? Some of my earliest memories are of watching the news and seeing soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, so I totally understood why my aunt thought same crap different day when she caught bits on the news. What she didn't realize was that a significant number of young British men and women were using Turkey as a staging post to be smuggled into another country, Syria. These people, who tended to be between the ages of 15 to 30, weren't off on their holidays or romantic weekends with partners. They were out to join a group which had been called many different things in many different countries. But here, they were called ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. My auntie's family were very similar to ours and very strict with their Islam. Zach was allowed to date, and he went to the pub for a J20 after 5-a-side football, and as far as my auntie knew, he was just about as far from an extremist as it was possible to get. And so this Turkey thing was either a romantic getaway or, as my uncle suggested, a trip to Istanbul to watch his football team play away. Now my aunt said that she wasn't in the least bit worried about Zach joining some bloody terror group, but then a few days later, she got a call from some kind of special constable who asked to visit her for a chat at home. My auntie is an oncology nurse, so she knew that it had to be bad news if the constable was delivering it in person. Then, much like me and her over cups of tea, the policewoman revealed their findings gently and gradually, like they were lowering her into a hot bath. Not all at once, just a little bit at a time. Authorities in Turkey were able to determine that Zach had deplaned in Istanbul and then had immediately boarded another flight to a city closer to the Syrian border. They were also able to track his movements to a hotel in that same city, but when they searched the room, they found it empty. The Turkish police then questioned the hotel staff and discovered a young man matching Zach's description had been spotted meeting an older man in the lobby. The staff remembered it because one man spoke Arabic with a distinctly Syrian kind of accent, while the other spoke it like he was still learning. Police were 90% sure that it was Zach who'd met with the Syrian guy, in which case there was a chance that that was his guide to help him get into Syria, and one of the reasons Zach might go to Syria was to join a terrorist organization. The policewoman in the UK didn't know if that was ISIS or the tons of other groups fighting against the Syrian government, but if he hadn't told my aunt, there was a good chance that it'd be something that she wouldn't approve of, meaning that there was a very distinct possibility that Zach had joined ISIS. Like I said, the policewoman broke it to her very gently, saying that they didn't know for sure what Zach was up to. She asked my aunt to forward them any emails or texts that he might send, or the details of any phone calls that she had with her son. I don't think that they do that with regular missing person cases, so that's what makes me think that they already knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. My aunt, on the other hand, refused to believe it. She said that she spent a few days in blissful denial until an email finally appeared in her work inbox. It was from Zach, and while he would have considered it an apology and an explanation, the police considered it nothing short of a typed confession. Zach didn't say exactly where he was, or even that he'd joined a particular group. He just said he was really sorry he didn't tell her, and he knew that she'd have stopped him if he did, and that he was fighting to protect the Syrian people from their government. The police later said Zach had most likely been coached on what to say, and that ISIS were doing what a lot of militaries did around the world, which was getting the recruits to email home to reassure friends and loved ones. It also served as a kind of recruitment tool by saying, "It's really nice over here," and that's just what Zach said. He said that he was happy to be in the caliphate, which is the Arabic word meaning religious state. He also said that he'd been welcomed like a hero, and that his ISIS commander had given him and a few other British lads a week's free stay in a luxury hotel, so they could acclimatize to the weather before their training started. Zach said that after that week was up, he wouldn't be able to reply to any emails for a while because they could only send them on secure connections or something. Now, my aunt also said that he seemed to think that once he'd laid out his reasons and all of that, my aunt might actually be proud of him. But she wasn't proud of him. She was terrified. She sent him an email back telling him to come home as soon as he was able, but he didn't reply for a couple of weeks. And when he did, my aunt said that he sounded brainwashed. In his email, the things Zach said sounded so unlike him that my aunt thought that someone else might have written it. Zach liked football, hip-hop, and was happy as Larry being at university with his mates. But in that email, he talked about jihad, martyrdom, and how much he hated the kuffar, the Arabic word for unbelievers. He was misquoting scripture and religious rulings to excuse what he'd done. And then in response to my aunt saying that she couldn't picture her little boy hurting anyone, he said that he wasn't her little boy anymore, and that the people he hurt weren't people at all, so she shouldn't feel bad if he hurt or even killed them. At one point in the email, Zach tried reassuring my aunt that not everyone he captured would be killed. For the most part, the women and kids he captured would either be kept as his own personal slaves or would make him rich after being sold in the slave markets. And as I said, my aunt struggled to believe that he'd written things like that. He didn't sound like her son at all. But then there were certain phrases and nicknames that he used to confirm for her that it had to be him. My aunt said that she ended up crying her eyes out with that policewoman over, and that the policewoman was struggling to hold back tears. She was a mom too, and she told my aunt that she could barely even imagine the pain that she was going through. There was also very little that they could do at that point because Turkish authorities couldn't pursue him into Syria, and the best my aunt could do was reply to the email Zach had sent, begging him to come home while tugging on his heartstrings. She did as the policewoman asked and wrote him long, heartfelt emails touching on his childhood, how much everyone loved him, and how he wouldn't get into that much trouble if he just came home and cooperated with the police. She had to wait weeks for another reply, and when it came, she hoped that what she'd said had gotten through to him, but it hadn't. Quite the opposite, actually, because what Zach wrote was even worse than before. He'd completed his training, and his first mission, his unit had been ordered to attack a Kurdish village in the north of Syria. The defenders fought fiercely but were eventually overrun, and then all the civilians were gathered in one place. Zach said they separated the men from the women and kids, and then one by one, they dragged the men into an open field and cut their heads off. Zach said he personally beheaded a man who prayed to some other god before he was killed. He said that confirmed what he was doing was the right thing, and that they hadn't sent him to kill other Muslims but unbelievers. All that was obviously massively upsetting for my auntie, but she said the worst thing about it was the glee with which he wrote his email. Zach acted like killing people and forcing women and kids into slavery was his single greatest achievement. He acted like it was his one-way ticket to Jannah al-Firdaus, the highest tier of heaven. And even though there is tons of stuff in the Quran which tells us not to hurt innocent people, only aggressors who threaten us in our homelands, though. One quote is from verse 32 of Surah al-Madah, and it says, "Whoever takes a life, it will be as if they killed all of humanity, and whoever saves a life, it will be as if they saved all of humanity." My aunt wrote that into one of her emails, but Zach only addressed it in a roundabout way, saying people were misquoting the Quran to justify Muslims being weak and not defending themselves. It was like Zach was ignoring everything which told him to be peaceful in favor of any verse that might possibly justify terrorism and murder. And it broke my auntie's heart so badly that I don't think she's ever going to fully recover. She emailed him back, once again begging Zach to come home, and then she waited for a reply that never came. That email, talking about the attack and cutting people's heads off, was the last time my auntie ever heard from Zach. According to the people from the Home Office, they think it's more than likely that Zach was killed, either during an attack or from a bomb dropped on him. She'd once hoped that he'd suddenly return home after ISIS's little terror kingdom fell apart, but again, he didn't. And there were no emails, no texts or calls, just a dead silence on his end, and he was never seen again. When she was done telling her story, my aunt asked me if I understood why she didn't want to talk about him anymore. I did. I could understand why she was so ashamed, angry, and upset, and I could understand why she didn't want any pictures of him around to remind her. Zach was dead, and even if he wasn't, the boy she raised was long gone. It wasn't even that she'd purged all thoughts of him from her mind. It's because she thought about him almost every minute of every day. She just didn't need anything to remind her of what her mind already tortured her with. This is probably the worst thing that's ever happened to me in terms of disgust and dread, and even worse, it's something that continues to affect my family to this day. A while back, I started on the road of fulfilling my dream of opening up a daycare center. I don't want to say what state I'm in exactly, but the background checks and regulations are like very, very strict. I'm not complaining too much about that because they should be if a person is trying to work with kids. But I had to wait months and months filling out all kinds of forms and sending over all kinds of information, and part of the overall process was making sure that there were no child predators living in the area that I wanted to open my daycare. There's a website that you can use to find out where they live, and I do not recommend to use it because, holy crap, it is creepy to see just how many there are. But that's what I used to cross-reference potential sites to make sure that it wouldn't be near someone dangerous. It literally tells you these dudes' names and little info bubbles near their homes, and I remember clicking on a couple, still cringing about how many there were. And then after clicking on one of the little icons, I saw a guy who had the exact same last name as me. Again, I don't want to say what that name is, I'm not trying to dox myself, and even if I didn't give a damn, I don't want people finding my family, you know? But my point is, it's not Smith or Johnson or whatever, something common. It's actually very uncommon, and I didn't recognize the guy's first name, so I was obviously very relieved too. But since I couldn't reassure myself that he wasn't family because of the rarity of our name, I called my uncle to ask him if I had a relative that I didn't know about. And the second I asked him, he then says, "Who told you?" And when I said that no one had said anything to me, he then told me that he'd come over to talk about it in person. It turns out this offender guy was a relative of ours, and the family had agreed to cut him off after the conviction, which by that point was almost 3 decades old, and he's already been released from prison. But after his explanation, it was time for my own, because he wanted to know how the heck I'd found out after all the older generation agreed the younger should never find out. And I told him about the whole daycare thing and how I needed to look up child predators. But when I mentioned where he lived, my uncle got very mad. Apparently, they told him that he had to leave the state because they didn't want him to darken their name any more than he already had. My uncle said that they made sure he moved away, but apparently he snuck back at some point and had been living a few counties over from us in secret. He asked what I was planning on doing about that daycare, and I told him I'd obviously have to find a different site. Our scumbag family member was the only one in the surrounding area, but with a daycare center, one is too many. But then right as I said that part, my uncle then responds, No. You keep your daycare where it is. Me and your uncles will handle it. I asked what he meant by handle it, and he told me not to worry, that within a week, I'd be able to hand in my completed daycare application without any child predators living in that area. Now, I had a lot of uncles growing up, and it was very much a case of them not always being my uncles. So when the uncle I spoke to said he was going to gather a bunch of them up so that they could handle the situation, I was so naive that I didn't hear that for what it was. When he called to say they'd handled it, my uncle added that I should probably wait a month or two before filing my application because they'd need to update the predator database to show that he didn't live there anymore. But before I could do that, I happened to catch a very brief news story on an offender that had gone missing a few counties over in almost the exact place I wanted to open my daycare. And then when they said the guy's name, I realized it was him. Our scumbag relative hadn't moved. He'd disappeared. I asked my uncle what had happened, what they did to make him disappear like that, but all my uncle would say is that they scared him so bad that he just up and vanished out of state. He'd show up again sometime in some far-off place, just not anywhere near us. But sometimes, I start to doubt that he was telling me the truth, and there's a little part of me that thinks that they probably did something way worse than just talk to him. He wasn't just an offender. He was a legit child predator, and although I never personally checked, he apparently had convictions for a bunch of different stuff like that. And so one of the darkest parts of this whole thing is that if my uncles did choose to take him out, I can't even say he doesn't deserve it. I got to open my daycare, and to this day I'm still living my dream and serving the community, and while I've never told another living soul about what my family had to do to make sure I could open it, I can't keep it on my chest for any longer. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sunday and Wednesday nights. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, use my face as a cushion. In May 1996, 2 young women disappeared into the quiet depths of Virginia's Shenandoah Forest and were later found dead at their secluded campsite, bound and silenced far from any trailhead. What should have been a peaceful hiking trip became a grim mystery whispered among the trees. Hear the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Now enjoy the stories. More than 3 decades ago, back when I was a much younger man, I helped a mate of mine move down to Glasgow from our home city of Newcastle. He'd managed to get a job as a football scout for Glasgow Rangers, which was basically his dream career. And so while me and all of our mates were sad to see the back of him, we were all really proud of him too. Now, we drove up early in the morning, and then once everything was unloaded, we had some pub grub and a few loggers, shandies from me, and then I started on the drive back to Newcastle. I'd left it quite late to drive back, so it was about midnight by the time I started to see signs for the English borders. The roads were quiet, with only the occasional lorry thundering past me, and I remember there being some phone-in thing on the radio, but I wasn't really listening. I was in my old Vauxhall Cavalier, an '82 model that I bought on the cheap about 4 years prior. It normally served me well, and it had been running fine all day, but just after passing a place called Jedburgh, the temperature warning light flicked on. I looked at my dash, watching the needle climbing into the red, and swore under my breath as I eased off the accelerator. Since it normally bought me a few minutes, I cranked the heater up full blast to try and pull some heat out of the engine. But that time, it seems my luck finally ran out, because just a minute or so later, there was this loud hiss from under the bonnet before steam started pouring out the seams. Seconds later, I heard this horrible metallic knocking sound coming from under the bonnet, and so I coasted over to the hard shoulder and then came to a stop just in time for the engine to seize up completely. And after that, aside from the ticking of my hazard lights and the sound of hot metal cooling down, there was nothing but silence for a few seconds, until I erupted. I remember shouting, "Are you effing kidding me?" a couple of times, and then, after taking a few deep breaths, I got out of the car and tried to fix it. And I tried it for half an hour, and in that time, a grand total of 2 cars passed me, but even with me waving at them as they passed, neither of them stopped. I didn't just stand there like some plonker for the whole 30 minutes, mind you. I popped my bonnet not long after getting out, but when I did, a load of steam and the smell of burnt coolant came wafting up into my face. And after waving away some of the steam, I spotted a crack in the top radiator hose and then noticed how loads of antifreeze was dripping onto the road and forming a big green puddle. I didn't have a spare hose, and neither did I have enough water to top it up properly, and even if I had, the engine had overheated so badly that I didn't trust it not to seize up again. Basically, I wasn't going anywhere in my old Vauxhall, and since there were no mobile phones back then, at least none for the likes of me, I had no choice but to walk if I wanted to get myself some help. Now, I reckon the nearest emergency phone would have been about a mile down the road, maybe more, and so I locked my car, left my hazards flashing, and then started walking along the dark grass verge with a torch in my hand. Now, I thought I'd be on the move for quite a while, but then no sooner had I started walking, I came to a dirt track, previously concealed by a long hedgerow, which led to what looked like a big 3-story farmer's house. Now, I was so happy that I was literally punching the air, because despite the fact that there were no lights switched on the ground floor, there was what looked to be candlelight in both the front-facing upstairs rooms. I felt bad for calling so late, but since the alternative of walking along the motorway was a much more dangerous one, I reckoned that I didn't have much choice. It was a particularly dark night, small moon and cloud cover, so it was only once I got closer to the house that I saw how run down it was. The ground floor windows were either cracked or newspapered over, and there were cracks in the wood too, along with a lot of peeling paint. And as you can imagine, I started to get really bad vibes from the place. But I try not to judge books by their cover too much, because you tend to be rewarded more times than you're burned for it. And so with that in mind, and granted very foolishly, I decided to knock on the door. I didn't knock too loud or aggressively. I didn't want to frighten anyone. But when my first knock got no answer, I knocked a little bit louder. Again, there was complete silence. No footsteps behind the door, no talking inside, nothing. But then after taking a step back and looking up at the top windows, I saw someone peeking out at me from behind a dirty-looking curtain. And I can't lie, it did scare me a bit seeing a pair of eyes staring back at me through the dim light. But as soon as I reacted, the eyes disappeared and I began to hear voices inside the house. Now, it sounded like a fair number of people, maybe half a dozen, and they were whispering like they were talking among themselves. I heard a little voice in my head saying, "They're awake, knock again." But before I could even dismiss it, I heard the sound of someone laughing inside the house. Not loudly, though, more like a muted sort of wheeze as they tried to keep their voice low. The bad vibes that I was getting ramped up to 11, so instead of risking a confrontation with whoever was either living or more likely squatting there, I decided to make a move. I turned around and walked back up the dirt path as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every so often to make sure that no one was following me. Now, I was quite certain whoever was inside was watching me from those windows, but as long as they didn't follow me, then I didn't mind what they did. I'd almost gotten to the end of the path to where those two wooden gate posts held no gate when I started smelling something strong on the breeze, something that smelled like burning. And then when I turned the corner and could see out onto the road again, I felt this almost involuntary scream jump out of my mouth as I realized what the smell was. It was my car. My car was on fire. Now, I suppose I acted on complete instinct in running over to it because there was absolutely bugger all I could do about putting out that fire. All I could do was just stand there, effing and blinding and looking around for whoever might have done it. But as you can probably guess, there was no one, and the whole area looked deserted. And I knew for a fact that it wasn't. When I realized just how much of a bad situation I truly was in, I started jogging along the road until I got back on the motorway. Now, it was only a 4-lane carriageway, so I could walk along the verge without being in too much danger, but no matter how much danger passing cars posed to me, it still seemed safer than hanging around my burning car in that creepy house. Now, I think probably about a half an hour must have passed with only the odd car going past me, and in that time, I didn't try to get anyone's attention just in case it was the people from the home. I mean, the joke was on them in a sense because that poor cavalier was definitely on her way out, but on the off chance they wanted to do more than just burn my car, I had to be very careful about who I revealed myself to. Now, I was bloody nervous for that first half an hour, but after that, I started to calm down a wee bit. I hadn't seen any cars or anything parked outside the house, and if they really did want to chase me down for whatever reason, I reckoned that I'd have encountered them already. So once I'd calmed down a bit, and after maybe 2 or 3 more cars passed me with me sticking to the trees on the verge, I made my way to the edge of the road and then stuck my thumb out at what looked like a Land Rover of some kind coming my way. Now, it slowed down as the driver saw me, but then instead of switching on the light above the wheel, someone in the passenger seat started shining a torch in my face after lowering their window. And right away, I knew that wasn't promising behavior when I realized whoever was in the car didn't want to be seen, and I turned and started walking away. Now, a second later, I heard a very promising, "Need a lift, pal?" Now, one that was just friendly enough to slow me down and make me think that I might have been overreacting. But then the second I slowed, I turned back to face the car, and the passenger doors opened up and I heard someone shout, "Get him!" Now, I remember running right at the trees at the side of the road. Not along the road where the car would have been able to cut me off, but at and then through the trees and bushes at the side of the road. I remember closing my eyes as I felt things scratching against my face, and then when I opened them, I found that I'd come to a fence on the other side. I hopped over it with speed and power that I didn't even know I had in me. I mean, I was hardly some couch potato back then, but I wasn't exactly in perfect shape either. But I swear, I think I vaulted that fence like an Olympic athlete for fear of what might have happened if those men had caught up with me. It's strange thinking back on it as well, because these days, all I do sometimes is sit and wonder why those people chose to go after me like they did. But in the moment, as I was running, it didn't matter a jot to me. All I knew was that those people were out to get me, and all that mattered in the world was getting away from them in that moment. Now, I ran across this big dark field for what felt like ages, running and running until I couldn't anymore. And then when I got to the other side and spotted a road ahead of me, I swear I saw that same Land Rover driving along the road with someone shining a torch out into the field. I had to change my route and head off at an angle to avoid the Land Rover, and along with anyone to my rear who might have followed me. I had to force myself to run when I didn't think that I could run anymore, and even though I was quite a fit young lad and one pumped full of adrenaline, I soon felt like that I was about to cough up a lung and fall over. In the end, I found myself staggering onto a road and then right back onto another dark field because I was too scared to be out in the open with a car full of blokes trying to find me. I kept on going like that until I came across a small town. And then as I was walking its dark and empty streets, looking for anyone who might be able to help, a police car appeared, and an officer asked what I was doing walking the streets alone like that. When I told him what had happened to me, he told me to jump in the car, and then off we went to the police station for a cup of hot tea and a few biscuits while I went into more detail about what had happened. As soon as I mentioned the house that I'd stopped by and mentioned how there had been people inside, I remember these two officers giving each other a look because they told me that the people inside must have been squatters. I thought that they might have been, partly because of how run down the house was, but the police confirmed that it was derelict and that there shouldn't have been anyone in there. They said that they'd head over and check it out, but they doubted anyone would be there. Squatters are kind of like rats. They're annoying and sometimes they're dangerous, but they're not stupid, and they just move on someplace else and then maybe return when things all blew over. But in all likelihood, they were gone from that house for good. I remember asking the two policemen why. As in, why had they burned my car before trying to hunt me down like that? And the first words out of the policemen's mouths were, "Well, what did you see?" He was convinced that I'd seen them doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, and after spotting my car, which they assumed was still functional, they tried to make sure that I couldn't get away before chasing me down. But that was the thing. I hadn't seen anything, and once I'd established that, all we could think of was that those squatters just wanted to scare me off. One of the policemen said that since they didn't know who I was, they might have assumed that I was some kind of bailiff or law enforcement agent, and at first they might have been worried that I was a policeman, but then when they realized that I wasn't, they must have reckoned that I was fair game for a kicking. And if only to make sure that I was too scared to return. And with nothing else to say, I gave the police the phone number for my flat in Newcastle, and then, since I literally lost everything but my wallet, one of them was kind enough to give me a lift to a nearby train station. It was long past dawn by then, so the trains were running, and I didn't have to wait long before I was on my way back to Newcastle. They phoned a few days later saying that that house was empty, and there wasn't much in the way of evidence tying anyone to the arson. They promised to keep their ears to the ground and would let me know immediately if there was any progress, but till then, they advised me to be patient because things like that took time. Sadly, that was the last I heard from the police, marking the end of my first encounter with squatters, and hopefully my last too. I had no idea that those people could be so violent. I mean, call me naive, but the squatters I was familiar with were the hippies who took over empty houses in London in the 60s. I thought that they'd be more into peace protests and drum circles than chasing down strangers. But I suppose times had changed then, and people changed with them. Almost 10 years ago now, way back in September of 2016, I drove all the way from LA to Phoenix to visit an old high school friend. Now, I was 31 and female, but still Hispanic and still small, and I drove out on a Friday and we spent all day Saturday together. And then, even though I planned to drive back home in the mid-afternoon on Sunday, I didn't end up leaving until about 9 p.m. at night. Now I know, I should have left earlier, and I know what I'm about to tell you is basically my own damned fault for not sticking to my plan. But even so, there are still nights sometimes, even all this time later, when I find myself waking up from nightmares with a cold sweat forming on my chest, having relived it all over again in my sleep. It was just after midnight when I rolled into Riverside County after passing over the Arizona state line. Now, a few people were still up in that area, so it wasn't completely dead, but after I passed the airport and the Mesa Verde complex, the 10 got super quiet again, and it seemed like there was no one but me out there for miles and miles. I was just trying to keep myself awake with some music and by blasting some cold air when suddenly, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rear view. Someone was coming up on me, and really fast too, and seeing how fast they were going, I honestly figured it was the police. I didn't panic or anything, I wasn't doing anything wrong, and I didn't have anything in the car that I shouldn't have, and so I just sat tight, kept my speed, and let them get closer and closer. When they got so close their headlights were blinding me if I looked up into the rear view, I figured they'd pass and keep going. But they stayed put, right behind me in the same lane, and didn't budge for at least a couple of minutes. I'm trying to figure out if these guys really are cops, because it looked like they were driving in one of those big sliding door vans. Only this one was all blacked out, like even the windows looked like they were tinted. Now, there was nothing on it to say that they were police and no lights on the top either, so I started getting really nervous thinking, what the hell do these guys want with me? Like I said, they stayed behind me like that for a couple of minutes, and then by the time they dropped back a little, they sped up to try and pass me, and I was actually super relieved. Now, I thought because they weren't trying to follow anymore, I was out of danger, when in reality, I was in more danger than I could have ever even imagined. I just let them pass, because what the heck was I going to do? But then instead of passing me and speeding off, the black van pulled back into the same lane as me and then started cruising maybe 10 to 15 minutes in front like it was trying to block me. I thought, oh, big deal, right? Like I could just slow down and lose them. But I didn't think that I'd need to, so I didn't. I stayed right where I was, slowing only a little to just a safe distance between us, and then kept on cruising just like the van was. Oh, I had no idea what they were up to, and I think maybe curiosity really did almost kill the cat here, because when the van's rear doors swung open and I saw a man in leathers with some kind of bandana wrapped around his face, I kind of just froze up. I couldn't think of a single good reason why he'd want to open the back doors like that, and for a second I thought that he might be planning on jumping out for some reason. I don't know what I was thinking. All I did was lean on the brake a little and put just a little more feet between myself and that van. I just had no idea that I'd moved right where he wanted me. I dropped back a little more, still wondering what the hell these guys were doing and why they didn't have any plates on the back of their van. I then watched as the man with the bandana around his mouth began to smile at me. I obviously couldn't see his mouth, but I could see it in his eyes. That or the dust was getting to him, because it's like he squinted before turning his back on me and carefully leaning down to grab something. Now, I might sound crazy or dumb to y'all who are reading this back in almost slow-mo, and maybe I was just too tired and slow or naive as heck, but I could not conceive of what he was about to do next, no matter how obvious it seems looking back on it. And so I just watched as the guy hauled something up into his arms, turned around, and then tossed it out onto the freeway in front of him. I saw what it was way too late, and I guess that moment of panic really did slow me down, but I had just enough in me to turn the wheel at just the right moment, so that when that old engine block came bouncing up off the blacktop, it smashed into my windshield on the passenger side and not into me. And once it hit, instinct told me to slam on the brakes, and so that's what I did, bringing my car to a spinning, screeching stop. Before I realized that I was covered in glass and there was basically a giant gaping hole where my windshield used to be. I just remember sitting there and shaking after I turned off my engine, and then I got out, walked to the side of the highway with my phone and dialed 911. And it wasn't until I described exactly what had happened as calmly as I could that I suddenly just broke down when the operator told me to stay on the line while she transferred me to someone. And after that, it was a case of guiding the cops and EMS to where I was so I could be taken to the ER. Aside from a few cuts and some mild whiplash, I was pretty much good to go, but I was reminded of just how lucky I'd been by that doctor. The cops had said the same thing, and that's why I say reminded, but at the time it didn't all the way feel lucky, and it wouldn't for quite some time. I knew I was lucky to be alive, and it wasn't like I was completely blind to how lucky I'd been in that respect. But all I could think about in the months afterwards was, why me? Like, why did they pick me of all the people they could have picked to throw a damn engine at? Like, I know they were trying to kill me. I just want to know what it was about me that made them think, yeah, this is the one. Let's turn her into hamburger meat. The cops didn't find that van or the people inside it, and I don't mean any disrespect to the boys in blue when I say this, but I didn't have much faith that they would. It was a black van, no plates, traveling in the middle of the damn night in the middle of the damn desert, and it might as well have been a ghost. And that fits too, because you know something? It sure as heck haunts me like one. More than 20 years ago now, back when my son James was still in elementary school, we took a trip down to Bethesda, Maryland from New York so he could see his grandma. Now, it was kind of messed up from the start, I guess, because I had something come up at work on the Friday we planned to leave. And this meant that I couldn't get on the road until about 8:30 in the evening, meaning I wouldn't arrive in Bethesda till after midnight at the latest. Now, I called ahead to my mom and made sure that was all okay, and she wasn't happy at having less time with her grandson, but there really wasn't much that could be done. And so after getting her to agree to stay up later than usual, me and James hit the road. About 2 hours into the journey, I stopped at a little gas station in Maryland when I realized I needed a coffee and a bite to eat. James was asleep in the back seat, and I was worried about waking him up as I shut my car door. But he was still at that age where when he was out, and his eyes stayed closed after I shut the door. I got one of those big, super strong gas station coffees, a soda for James, and then a bag of those mini powdered donuts because I knew all that sugar would push me through the rest of the way. And then after walking back to my car, I found James was awake. And thinking that shutting my car door really had woken him up, I apologized and then turned in my seat to hand him his drink. And that's when I saw the key ring that he was now holding. At first glance, it looked like a little clown holding a sign of some description, and I asked him what it was while taking a look at it and saw how the clown's little sign read, "Flying Plow Circus." It wasn't plastic either, like it was mass-produced. It was wooden and looked almost handmade. And when I asked James where he got it, he said a man had given it to him. Now, naturally, this didn't ring any alarm bells at first, and I was about to just let it go. But then I asked when the man gave it to him, to which James replied, "A minute ago, while you were in the store." Again, this didn't scare me like it should have, because I'd locked my door. Now, I'd never leave my kid in an unlocked car like that while I went into a store, and since sleepy 6-year-olds aren't the most reliable and frequently play pretend, I didn't really take them seriously. But that's when James said something along the lines of, "Yeah, he did something funny to the door, then it opened, then he told us to go visit sometime." Now, I remember my pulse getting faster as I asked James if he was serious, and if he was sure. He told me he wasn't lying, and that the man used some kind of wire to open the door. Now, by the time he said that, my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I asked what the guy looked like, and James just said, "Normal." And then as I got out of my car and looked around the parking lot, I don't think I'd ever been so close to a panic attack in my whole life. I tried to calm myself down as best I could, and then I asked James to tell me the whole story again from start to finish. He was starting to pick up on my vibe, so he was starting to get all confused and kind of upset, and I had to assure him that he hadn't done anything wrong and that he just needed to tell me what happened, and then he went over it with me a second time. It made my skin crawl to think about, and it still does. The thought of some creep watching people, waiting for an opportunity to break into someone's car so they could creep on their kid. Like, I know all the guy did was give James a keyring, but that's his cover story, right? All he's doing is giving the kid a keyring till the parents take too long coming back, and then it's diddling or abduction time. I asked James if he said or did anything weird, or if he acted in a weird or creepy way, and James said the only weird thing he said was, "Your dad knows me." And even though he was 6, he was skeptical seeing that we didn't even live there. I was freaked out, y'all. The idea of what might have happened scared the hell out of me, but once I saw that there was no one around for me to blame, that fear turned to frustration and then straight up anger. I think if James had pointed someone out like that's him, I'd have straight up torched that dude, and I'd be writing this from prison or something. Not that a jury in their mother effing land would convict me of something like that, but you see my point. I told James to hand me the keyring, and then told him if anything like that ever happened again, he should yell for me, as loud as he could, and he wasn't to stop until I'd appeared to protect him. I told him he'd been very brave and he hadn't done anything wrong, and then gave him the speech on how not everyone who acts friendly wants to be friends. And then once all that was said and done and my heart rate had returned to normal, sort of, we got back on the road again. I remembered the name of the road that I was on a couple of minutes later because I looked it up later when I decided to call the cops. It was called Conowingo Road, a name I don't think I'll ever forget because I was driving down and I saw the sign saying Flying Plow Circus 1 mile ahead. I remember how the rage boiled up in me like you wouldn't believe, and I actually put my foot down thinking, I'm gonna give these a-holes a piece of my mind. I powered along the highway, probably dipping over the speed limit a couple of times, till I finally found a sign saying Flying Plow Circus next right. I don't know exactly what I was planning. Maybe just find where the carnies' trailers were, then curse up a storm on how they needed to keep a leash on their pedo coworkers before he gets himself shot. I wasn't dumb enough to start a fight with a whole bunch of random circus folk, and I wasn't about to let their buddy get away with what he did either. But then after making the turn and driving down this dark dirt road to where a circle of trailers were sat, I changed my mind completely. If I could describe that collection of trailers in 2 words, those 2 words would be horror and movie. And there was a fire in the middle of them and a bunch of people gathered around it. And then when they saw my car, I saw a couple of them turn to look at me. I couldn't make much out. They were just these dark shapes with the fire in the background, but that made them even creepier looking. I realized that it might not be a case of one rogue carny, and for all I know, the whole gang might have sent that one guy out looking for a kid to snatch and bring back to them. Now I just kept on watching them, watching me for maybe half a minute more, and then after taking one look at James in the back, who by then had fallen back asleep, I thought, screw this, and then turned around and drove off. Now before James was born, if something like that happened where someone made me mad enough to hunt them down, then yeah, maybe I'd have gotten my car and been dumb enough to get my ass kicked by a dozen pissed off carnival folk. But after he was born, it was like I had this safety software installed onto my brain where everything I did sparked the thought of, how is this going to end for me? There was no point trying to defend him from something I wouldn't survive confronting, because being a parent is literally all about living to fight another day. Life's not a game anymore for me. I have to do everything I can to protect my kid, and it's just scary as hell when you try and do all the right things and still end up with some creep breaking into your car. I called the cops from my mom's place that next day after telling her all about the man, the key ring, and all the signs from the Flying Plow Circus. They called me back basically saying that they'd been stonewalled and that no one admitted to slipping out from their camp after dark, not even for a second. And that's what confirmed it for me. If they were just a bunch of innocent, good-natured carnies just making their way in the world, then I doubt that they'd have stonewalled a pair of cops who came around asking about a kitty creeper. If there was some sketchy loner on my crew and I thought that they were up to no good, and I mean really up to no good, I'd want them gone. So the fact that they all sort of said, "I don't know what you're talking about, officers," and that made me think that they were in on it and they were just covering for their boy. On the journey back from my mom's and while driving in daylight, I slowed near that turn that I'd seen the trailers on but didn't see any signs for the Flying Plow Circus. Now, I'm guessing that they moved on after the visit from the cops, and after looking it up, I don't think the whole Flying Plow thing was their regular name. Flying Plow something, I can't remember if it was a road or a lane or whatever, was the name of the place that they set up on, so wherever they went, they'd probably put up some new signs and under a new name, and then on they'd go. I don't even know if they were running an actual circus. I saw plenty of trailers, but no big top. But what I do know is that one of them went out looking for kids, and almost certainly for no good reason at all. My name's Hank. I'm a proud Texan, and I work as a bus driver taking folks all over this great state of ours. Most of those journeys take place during the day, but sometimes I like to earn a little extra pay by taking the overnight journeys, or what you might call the red eyes. I fire up that big old rig around dusk, load her up with the sleepy travelers heading either home or away, and then take off along those long, lonely highways that stretch from Houston to El Paso and every place in between. I wouldn't call it a difficult job, but as long as you can keep the wheels turning through the witching hours and dodge all those back road deer, you can almost guarantee everybody gets where they're going safe and sound by sunup. And it's not often the bus causes you problems, because if you keep her clean and well-oiled, and she'll keep you moving and happy. It's the people that complicate things, though. Not every kind of person, but a certain kind, and all the worst rides have been down to that certain kind of person. Including this one, which was probably the worst I have ever experienced. Driving the bus across Texas at night with nothing but country songs and the stars to keep me company, it sometimes makes me feel like a night watchman, one charged with guarding the whole damn state. Now, I meet all kinds of interesting people on that open road under the big Texas sky, and then watching the sun rise over the prairies after a long shift, it's pure gold, but the cons hit hard too. Your sleep schedule gets all turned around, so whenever you're working nights, you miss out double on family dinners and weekends with the kids. The fatigue creeps up on you too, and dealing with rowdy passengers or breakdowns in the middle of nowhere is no picnic. But every so often, you get a special kind of rowdy. The kind that's not just drunk and loud or complaining about fellow passengers' body odor. The kind that's dangerous. Real dangerous. Back during the fall of 2007, I was on a run from Dallas to Austin, driving through the pitch black with nothing but tumbleweeds and truck stops for miles. I had this fella riding with me about 6 rows back, one that had been staring out the window and kind of muttering to himself, at least according to a fellow passenger anyway. I couldn't hear him at first, so it must have been nothing but a few grumbles and not enough to cause a scene. But then after maybe an hour on the road, I started hearing him as he started to raise his voice. I looked up into my mirror to see folks shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody said a word. That happens more often than not. People learn to tune out the oddballs on long bus rides like that, but the guy didn't get any quieter. He only got louder, and as he did, the tension in the air got thicker and thicker. My guy twisted something fierce knowing trouble was simmering, and I just prayed that it'd blow over, sort of like a false alarm, but it didn't. When it came, the guy went off like a firecracker on the 4th of July, almost like his fuse was sizzling away for a while, and then bang, off he went, and there was no stopping him. I heard someone say something to him, I guess a sort of shut up or something to that effect, and the guy replied with a full-throated roar, and then went at that challenger like a freaking skunk pig. I looked back for just a second to see him leaning across the center aisle, lunging at the person I assumed did the back-talking. I had to keep my eyes on the road, but I looked up into the mirror to see fists raining down, and then the sound of passengers screaming along with a doom, doom, doom of the big guy's fists against the other's face. They weren't fighting. It was like a beating. The kind that, if it wasn't stopped, was going to end in a casket and a family dressed in black. The bus exploded into chaos as the beating continued, with some people running for cover toward the rear and others charging the attacker to try and end the assault. And when he realized what was going on, the attacker sort of wheeled around and started swinging on the folks trying to stop him. And let me tell you, this man was no small specimen. From what I could tell, he made short work of the people trying to stop him, and I think he straight up knocked a guy out too, because something freed him up to go back to wailing on the first guy he attacked, who by then was out cold and leaking blood from his nose and mouth. I didn't get a picture of all of this until later, obviously, because I was mostly trying to keep my eyes on the road while keeping an eye on the situation behind me using my driver's mirror. But then as soon as I realized the violence wasn't about to stop anytime soon, I started slowing us down so I could pull us over and get as many people as possible off that bus. I didn't hit the brakes in a sort of screaming tires kind of way. You can't do that on a bus with people standing unless you want them falling head first. And while I didn't mind if our psycho attacker banged his head on an armrest, I had to consider the other passengers too. I brought the bus to the side of the road as fast as I could, which felt painfully slow given what was happening right behind me. And then once we'd come to a stop, I opened up the doors and began hollering for people to get out as quickly as they could. I think I herded about 12 to 14 people out of the front, and there were women clutching their children, a couple of old-timers who couldn't move as fast, but everyone else moved like greased lightning. Everyone except the people trapped on the back of the bus who were being blocked from the front exit by our raging psycho. We had an emergency exit at the back of the bus, so I started yelling at the people in the back to pull the lever and push the door open so they could all scramble out onto the road. I don't know if they just couldn't hear what I was saying over the sound of their screams, or they were too scared to turn their backs on that attacker, but they didn't do as I asked. I kept on yelling louder and louder, but then the psycho turned his attention to me and then came charging down the bus while roaring like some beast. I tried to put something between us, that something being the driver's seat, but as most of you can probably imagine, all he had to do was move a yard to the side and his fists had unfettered access to my face. I felt a couple of punches and kicks, but all I could do was try and shield my head in the hopes that he didn't do any serious damage. At one point, the guy actually grabbed one of my arms by the wrist and pulled it away so he could punch me right in the eye. All it took was one punch, and it felt like I couldn't see out of it anymore, and I knew it'd only take a couple of more of that to do some serious damage. The same pattern played out again, with people trying to get him off of me before being beaten back, and then he turned back to me and started all over again, but he didn't last long because maybe a second or two later all I heard was, "Hey, right here!" It was a young voice, almost sounded a bit like a kid's, and then bam, there was a gunshot, and then I heard that attacker start to groan. I looked around, the vision in my right eye still kind of cloudy, and I saw the attacker was curled up on the floor of the bus near the exit stairs, and he was clutching at his belly with a blood stain getting bigger and bigger on his shirt. Standing over him was this black kid with a gun, and I say kid as he must have been in his late teens, probably early 20s, but there he was, standing over the guy with a smoking pistol, telling him if he tried to get up, he'd blow his head off. With the attacker put down, and with all the fight having left him, the other passengers were able to get off the bus. People were treating the kid with the gun like he was some hero, but all he seemed interested in was getting out of there. I told him to hold his horses because the cops wouldn't arrest a man for defending people like he did, but he turned to me and, with a sort of scared look in his eye, he says, "It ain't legal. It ain't legal, man. I gotta go now." And then off he went. Lord knows where, and that's honestly the last I saw of him. With folks huddled outside in the cold, yes, Texas nights can get cold, I called in what had just happened on my cell and then waited with the rest while they either cried, hugged each other, or just stared into space like I did, wondering how the heck things all went so bad so fast. And not long after, we all saw lights flashing red and blue across the flatlands, and then as they got closer, they were joined by sirens. State troopers rolled up first. Their guns were drawn so they could secure the scene, and then they gave him the lowdown on that berserker. I mentioned the shooter too, and I know I should have been honest with him, and I might have been a little selective over what I remembered because God knows I didn't want that kid's good deed treated like a bad one. Once the cops had the scene secured, the EMTs came right behind them. They hauled off that unconscious fellow with his face all busted up and then stretchered off that young woman too, the one the attacker had given a few hard licks. And they even checked the attacker too, who was still alive but in a lot of pain, and then with him handcuffed to a stretcher, they took him away with a cop sitting in the back of the ambulance with him. The cops questioned everybody, taking statements while I stood there feeling like I'd aged a decade in about an hour. And the company I worked for got a replacement bus out to us as quickly as they could, and then once the dust settled and the authorities cleared us to go, we were back on the road again. We were minus a couple of passengers because some had chosen to wait for kin or friends so they could ride with them instead, but we were also plus one because I got to sit back and enjoy the ride with the new driver at the wheel. The atmosphere on the bus now was pretty dark, with folks whispering to each other about what had just happened. But I preferred the talk because, when it came, the silence was honestly heavier than a lead blanket. I still think about that kid sometimes, the one who shot our attacker before he could do any serious damage to me. I guess if you told me about a guy like that walking around with an illegal gun, I'd have assumed that he was the bad guy. And I guess he sort of was one of the bad guys if he was a felon or what have you. But then all it took was one pull of the trigger at that right moment, and he became kind of a hero to me. I know there's no such thing as a perfect person, but since that night, I've never been so convinced of the existence of flawed heroes. So I used to drive taxis in Liverpool back in the 80s. Now, it was great money for what it was, and so even though I only planned on doing it long enough to find a replacement for the job I'd lost, I ended up driving for almost 3 years before I finally gave up. A big appeal was that I could work when I wanted. If I had something that needed doing in the daytime, be it something with the kids' school or whatever, I could just take a few hours off, take care of business, and then head out on the jobs again at night to make up the hours. And there was no doing that in a factory or down on the docks, not without getting your pay docked anyway. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, and I remember one particular job where for a minute or two, it didn't look like I was going to make it home to my family that night. It started when a job came through just after 10 p.m., asking me to take someone from Agberth Vale to Anfield. I got the address, drove over, and then parked up outside a small 2 up, 2 down on a dark and quiet street. I didn't want to beat my horn, which was the usual method of letting a customer know that we were outside, so I gave dispatch a buzz on my radio and asked them to call the customer back to let them know that I was waiting. Dispatch said no one picked up the phone, but then maybe a second or two later, I saw someone walking out of a house and towards my car. Now, as I said, it was dark, so even though I saw the shape of them moving towards the back passenger door, I didn't get a good look at them until they were sitting behind me, and when I did, I almost pissed my kecks. He was wearing a balaclava, and after he shut the door, he sank down low in the seat to make it harder for him to be seen from the outside. Now, he had what looked like a jerry can of petrol in one gloved hand, and then with the other, he pulled out what looked like an old detective gun from his jacket, like a proper six-shooter, and pointed it directly at me. He said if I tried to run, I'd be shot. In fact, if I did anything that even remotely upset him, I was a dead man. Now, my only job was to do what he said, and when he said it, and if I did, I'd go home alive that night. And so, seeing as I didn't have much of a choice, I drove where he told me to go. We ended up parked up across from a pub not far from the Rialto on Upper Parliament Street, I remember, and the lad in the back told me to turn off the engine and then spent the next 15 minutes or so checking his watch and peering up over the solid part of the door to watch the pub through the window. He kept on checking his watch, and I kept getting the urge to try and talk him out of whatever he was about to do. But every time the words were about to come out, something stopped them. I stayed quiet, and then noticed that when the clock on my dash hit 11 p.m., the lad in the back started getting even twitchier. When I noticed people coming out of the pub, obviously around kick-out time, the lad told me to start the engine. He was watching the pub doors like a hawk, and then suddenly, he started rolling down the window all frantically before he pointed the gun out the window, shouted something I couldn't make out, and pulled the trigger. One of the fellas who just walked out of the pub hit the concrete like a wet sack of spuds. Someone screamed, and then the guy in the back seat let out a scream of his own as he told me to drive. I obviously had to stay under the speed limit where possible, but it was tough with a gun pressed in the back of my head every so often, with its owner telling me that if I stopped for the police or took us down any dead ends, I'd be getting one to the back of the dome. The lad directed me to drive all the way out towards Speke to some of the derelict land near where the airport is today. He told me to get out of the car and then started emptying that can of petrol all over the seats after joining me outside. And that was the closest I had got to trying to do something when I realized that I was about to lose my car. I know that probably sounds horrible, seeing as I didn't do anything about him shooting that fella outside the pub, but I wasn't really in any position to do anything back then, whereas watching him pour that gasoline with his back to me, I knew that there was a very slim chance that I'd be able to get the drop on him. But if I didn't, I was a dead man. And so I basically talked myself out of it in my head and then watched as he set my car on fire and then ran off into the darkness. I just remember feeling numb. Less than an hour before, I hadn't even received the job yet, and then just a short while after parking outside that house to pick them up, my life had been changed forever. We obviously didn't have any phones back then, so I couldn't just call the police with a mobile like I would now. I had to walk all the way to a payphone, which took quite a while before I could contact the police, and only then could I give them any details. All I wanted to do was go home, get in the bath, and crack open one of the beers that I had waiting for me in the fridge. But the police wanted me to wait where I was so I could guide them to where my car had been dumped. It honestly didn't take all that long, and I'm grateful the police got out to me so fast, but the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go back to where my car was still smoldering and repeat my story for a second time. But I had to, because the most important thing was making it really bloody clear that my part in the murder was an unwilling one, and I did that by giving them as much info as possible on the man that had done the shooting. But when they asked if I'd be willing to appear in a court at a later date, I told them no. Call me a coward, but to me, you'd have to be mental to testify against some gangster in this city. Maybe if I was in London or New York or somewhere like that, but not Liverpool, because everyone knows everyone round here. And they said that I might get asked again if murder detectives were put on the case and they found someone they wanted to charge. But the fact that I never got that call is the only proof that I need that they didn't catch anyone. I used to have nightmares about it too, proper horrible ones as well. But nowadays I just have these dreams. Not quite nightmares, but still clear enough for me to remember when I wake up in the morning. And sometimes in those dreams I do what I wanted to do in the moment and beg the killer to reconsider. But no matter what I say and no matter how I say it, he never, ever listens. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your own story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the beacons are lit. Gondor calls for aids. So I'm a vet and I specialize in farm animals, livestock, and particularly horses. This means I'm often on call and working the night shift. I was on a call on this particular night when this happened, and I thank the Lord that I was, and also wish that I wasn't. It was not a nice night, but ultimately I feel like if I haven't been there, at least 2 other human beings would be dead, if not 3, and a horse, which to me is just as important. I was on a call watching some garbage on Netflix when my cell phone rang. It was Irene Capson, one of the 2 ranch owners along with her husband, who lived out on Iron Road Way. Now, I was a big fan of the Capsons. They'd been clients of my father before me when I was still just a little girl and longed to join the family business. They were in their late 60s, and they only called if there was a really, really good reason to. They were the kind of farmers who rarely had need for a vet because they knew how to take care of things themselves, for better or worse. And this was one of those cases that was worse, though. Their eldest, most beloved mare, Dapple, was on his last legs, and there was nothing they could do to ease his pain, and that meant that it was up to me. It was a 40-minute drive to the Capson Ranch, but it took me about an hour in the dark, as a careful and somewhat paranoid driver, especially on country roads, which are absolute death traps if you've ever had to navigate them at night. When I pulled up at the Capson Ranch, I cursed because my Jeep had already gotten stuck in the mud, which was unusually left without sawdust. I was also a little concerned because, as well as the Capson's vehicles, there was an ATV I didn't recognize. It didn't even look new, but I guess it could have belonged to one of the ranch workers. Irene Capson had told me that it would only be her and her husband present at the ranch, though, and to meet them in the barn, so alarm bells were already kind of ringing in my mind. The first thing I did was grab my heavy, highly important equine medical case from the back of my Jeep, and then, cursing again as I waded through the mud, almost losing my gumboots multiple times, I headed toward the barn. Now, before I even reached the barn, I could tell something was wrong. Now, the door was open more than a crack, and I could hear an unfamiliar voice coming from inside, who did not sound at all friendly. I managed to find a crack in the barn slats that allowed me to spy through without hopefully getting noticed. And the narrative I began to piece together filled me with incredible dread. A younger man held the Capson couple at shotgun point. I could make out everything they were saying. I won't recount it at all because a lot of it simply involved the younger man, whose name was Daniel, cursing a lot at his parents. He was throwing some really vile, unrepeatable language out there, things I'd be ashamed to say to anyone, let alone my own parents. And that's something else I learned. Daniel was their son. His purpose for being at the farm was to try and persuade the couple to loan him $30,000. He made no secret of the fact that this would help fund his lifestyle, which largely seemed to involve taking meth and some kind of lunatic plan to set up a lab with his friend. Apparently, the friend was providing the lion's share of the funds, and the Capsons were begging Daniel to realize that this was a scam. There would be no meth lab. They would not become the real-life Walter and Jesse, and at best, he would blow the money on drugs. Daniel's response to this was to threaten to blow them away and simply take everything he could. He claimed he knew the safe code, and as much as it would destroy him to kill his own parents, it would destroy him even more if he couldn't get the money. I knew I had to step in. I snuck away from my spy hole and slipped through the crack in the door. Now, the kid hadn't noticed me, and neither had Irene Capson. Unfortunately, the dad Capson did notice me and couldn't stop the look of relief from crossing his face. And while I was flattered that Mr. Capson saw me as their savior, it did unfortunately mean that the younger Capson's son saw me as a threat. He whirled around. The shotgun was now pointed at me. I just stammered and stuttered, almost peeing myself because I had never had a gun pointed at me before. I faced down angry charging bulls. I've been kicked by a horse. I've climbed a tree to avoid 30 to 50 feral hogs. Now, granted, it was more like 7, but that's not a joke, and I operated on a tiger who started to wake up during the procedure. I've calmed an angry hippo, but nothing has left me as terrified, as shaken, and unsure as the young Daniel Capson pointing his gun at me. I'd almost forgotten what I was there for, and then I noticed his eyes flicked to Dapple in the stall nearest me. Without taking his eyes off me, he asked his parents, "Is Dapple okay?" And I remembered from growing up as a little kid when he was a teen that Dapple had been his horse, his beloved horse, back before whatever the hell happened to him happened. Now, over his shoulder, Irene admitted that no, Dapple was not okay, that I'd been called to the ranch late at night to see if there was anything I could do to ease Dapple's suffering. The Mr. Capson started pleading with his son, begging him, asking him if that's really what he wanted Dapple's final memory of his beloved boy to be. And at first I thought that Daniel was too far gone, that his love for drugs outweighed his love for Dapple, and then he began to cry and asked me if I could save him. I lied and said yes. I told him that I needed to reach into my medical bag to grab some equipment to help make Dapple better. Not many people know this, but some vets carry pistols as part of their medical kit, particularly vets who specialize in horse care. It's often the easiest and most painless way to put a horse to sleep, a bullet through the center of the brain. And that hadn't been the plan for Dapple, let me just say that, but it was certainly my plan for their son. I pulled the pistol out, aimed it at him, and unwaveringly told him to drop the shotgun. Daniel was a broken man at this point. He told me through tears that the shotgun wasn't even loaded, that he'd never shoot his parents, and that I could shoot him in the head if I wanted to end his pain, as long as I promised to do all I could for Dapple. I had no such intention of shooting him, but I did demand that he drop that gun. However, to all of our horror, the shotgun was loaded. I'm guessing by accident or somehow including a single shell left over. The gun bounced off a wooden plank on the barn floor and managed to fire into the ceiling. It scared everyone but caused no damage, thank God, but it caused the other 3 horses in the barn to go absolutely crazy. So now I was surrounded by 3 screeching, braying horses, as well as a wailing Capson family. From the fact they'd all collapsed to the ground at this point and pulled each other into a reconciliatory family hug, I figured I was safe. I still made a point of grabbing the shotgun and tossing it out of the barn, then immediately went to Dapple. The rest can be summarized here, though. Dapple, despite being an old horse, just had an infection. He wasn't dying, and I was able to save him, and the local cops showed up before any of us had a real chance to call them. The current deputy sheriff grew up with Daniel, was one of his best friends in fact, and between all of us and an unwillingness to ruin Daniel's life even further, we were able to avoid any criminal charges. The caveat was that he had to spend the required amount of time in a rehab facility, which, to his credit, he has. 5 years later, Daniel is a head rancher on the farm, giving his parents a chance to enjoy semi-retirement. I'm his go-to veterinarian, and I've spent a lot of time there. Now, I wouldn't say that we're romantically close, but we are becoming good friends. Sober, clean Daniel is the lovely, lively, smart teenager that I remember. So while that was the most terrifying night shift of all time and the most terrifying moment of my life, I can't help but feel proud. I saved a family. I saved a man from addiction, and most importantly, I saved a horse. Dapple lasted a few more years until he passed away peacefully in his sleep, and Daniel is currently training Dapple Jr., and I'll be honest, I'm putting a little extra effort into that horse's medical care and upkeep. A dark story with, at least currently, a happy ending, and I wish they could all end like this. I work at a grocery store that I won't name in Detroit, and I work almost exclusively on the third shift, so thankfully I don't have to deal with customers, and I spend most of my time stacking shelves and doing busy work. It might not sound like a glamorous job, but it's something to earn me a little money while I finish my college degree, which I'm actually set to graduate with honors. Now, it's very, very rare that anything weird happens during the third shift. Some of the workers can be a bit weird, but aren't we all who work at night? No, I'm just projecting, but I usually arrive at the store during closing time, by which all the customers have been tossed out on their butts. I don't know what happened in this particular case. Maybe she was hiding in the bathrooms or tucked away in a display or God knows what. But short version shorter, there was an elderly female customer left in the store with us when it should have been just us workers. Now maybe you'd imagine her wandering around lost or looking for her dead husband or demanding to know where we keep the pasta. Aisle 3, by the way. But no, she snuck through the whole of the store unseen, like solid freaking snake, and none of us had a clue that she was even in the store for the first hour of our shift. Now, the first sign that something was wrong was a sudden foul smell emanating from the fish department. Myself and my colleague Cherry rushed over there, curious as to what had suddenly caused a fish to just go rotten. Had a tuna exploded or something? But nothing could have prepared us for what we saw. The old woman had crawled inside the iced fish display, which was actually due to be emptied by one of us at some point, and she was rolling around inside of it, tearing fish apart with her bare hands and somehow treating them like her worst enemies. We watched in horror and, I guess, kind of amusement. We could only stare as she saw the goddamn octopus sitting there, some kind of delicacy that they didn't port it in because God knows why. Apparently people eat these things, and squid. And she was muffled by the glass, but we heard her screaming something like, "There you are," at the octopus, and began trying to tear into it. Now, octopi are stretchy and pretty hard to just tear with your hands, so this old lady had the brilliant idea to just sort of gnaw on the octopus with her teeth. Only it turns out that she wore dentures, and after a number of attempts of biting the octopus's tentacles off, she got her dentures stuck in its forehead. Thankfully, someone had called the cops by now who showed up, but it was like nobody wanted to intervene. We wanted to see what she'd do next, and unfortunately, what that involved was smashing her way out of the glass cabinet housing the fish, creating an even more disgusting smell as she charged towards us. We soon realized that there was more to it than fish. She'd soiled herself. Now, this might all seem funny to you, and frankly, it was right up until this moment. Then, covered in broken glass and bleeding profusely from shards, she lunged at Cherry, tackled her, calling her an octopus woman and accusing her of inserting eels into various orifices, and I think some troll grandson of hers had shown her some of the famous shock memes and it had just broken her brain. And the whole thing ended with the cops having to actually tase her and try to bring her down, but she was having none of it. She somehow withstood the entire taser blast. I guess it was pretty weak since they thought that she was just some old woman. And then she charged back to the fish counter, grabbed as much seafood as she could carry, and then jumped on Cherry again. Now, the next thing we know, she's trying to force an entire octopus down Cherry's throat while whipping me with some eel, and I know it sounds funny as hell, but it was honestly terrifying at the time. The fish were pierced with broken glass, and she was forcing broken glass down Cherry's throat, and she was pierced with broken glass herself, meaning that she was cutting Cherry up. And so here's the final kicker. The old woman wasn't an old woman at all. She was an old man who had made a living as a fisherman and lost his livelihood thanks to commercial fishing and grocery stores like ours switching from locally sourced produce. He had dressed as his wife because after he went bankrupt during the Great Fish Recession, she died of a heart attack, and he blamed just about everyone he could, but mostly us. Apparently our store chain had been his biggest local client, and so it ended up being a tragic and horrifying and scary incident. Cherry suffered severe damage and bleeding to her trachea, as well as some scars all over her body from the broken glass, and the store managed to keep almost all mention of it out of the papers, and The poor psychotic fisherman was taken away to spend his remaining years in psychiatric care. I still work at the grocery store on third shift, but hopefully not for much longer after I graduate. Jerry's doing just fine now, but we all insisted that we were not willing to stock imported octopi in the fish counter from there on in. Word of advice: never work in a gas station at night. This might sound kind of dramatic, but I'd rather crawl over broken glass, work down in the sewers, or be Hassan Piker's dog than work night shift at a gas station again. Maybe day shift is better, but my a-hole boss, who I really want to call a slur but don't want to get you demonetized, forced me to work night shift and night shift only. I was a 22-year-old high school dropout who'd spent 6 months in juvie and bounced from foster family to foster family, so I guess I was lucky enough to find work at all. But good God, I am very sure that it wasn't legal to force a 22-year-old to work 5 night shifts a week every week without ever changing to day shifts. And there were a lot of things about Gary's gash and groceries that weren't strictly legal, but I'm not a rat, and Gary's been buried in the ground for nearly 20 years now. Not to mention the fact that I'm now with his daughter and she has my kid on the way, so I gotta play nice. So I'm not trying to sound like some jerk here, but Lana, Gary's daughter, is the one baiting me to write this right now. I'm actually a very nice guy in my personal life, and I'm gonna pop the question to Lana before our baby boy is born. You know, what's a better place for a proposal than a freaking Let's Read video? Lana, you make me the happiest I'd ever been, and I can't wait to raise our son with you. Now, through the power of Joel of the Golden Voice, I'm asking, will you marry me? Now, let's quickly move on to the story in case she says no. If she says yes, though, well, this will be the first serious proposal you performed on the channel, and I hope so. Now anyways, the point is, Gary was a greasy, greedy dude, and let's just say that I'm glad Lana inherited certain things from her Catholic mother rather than certain things from her father. But enough about that. We had some absolutely effing weirdos who dropped in during the night shift. There was this one guy who would spend a sickening amount of money on scratch cards, and I don't think he ever won a single cent. And from the way he dressed, he was clearly trailer trash too, and a few times I remember saying, "Buddy, do you think you should cool it with the gambling? I'm genuinely concerned about you." And you know how he responded? He hissed at me. Not even a word, he just hissed. After 3 times of that, I just gave up. So there was that scratch-off jack-off, and then there was the 7-foot-tall man who came in at precisely 2 a.m. every day and bought a single Red Bull, a pack of Marlboro Lights, and one of those massive pickles in the plastic packets. Just those 3 items every single time. And the guy looked like he was about 90 as well, and sure, he was a skinny mofo, but there was absolutely no way that I was questioning him on his purchases, especially not after the hissing gambler. Now finally we had this kid, and he looked about maybe 8 tops, who would come in at around 5 in the morning every single Tuesday and Thursday, and would ask if we had any X-Men trading cards for sale. And I explained to him every single time that we didn't sell trading cards of any kind, but that didn't put him off. He'd be there every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork, and when I told him no, he looked so upset and despondent, really. And so one day I went to the local comic shop and just got like 6 little packs of X-Men trading cards, and when the kid came in next, I presented him with the packs because surely one of them was the right brand that he was looking for. And the kid looked at the pack of cards, called me a retard, and then threw the packs back at me and stormed out. Now to this day I have no idea what I did wrong. The guy in the comic store told me that these were all X-Men trading cards that existed, but I guess I really don't know what I guess, but I never saw the kid again anyway, and that was kind of a relief. And I'm pretty sure that in the future someone met this kid, and he was the inspiration for that duck song about the lemonade and the grapes, and if you know, you know, Google it. Now speaking of kids and short people, it's time to start the creepiest of these stories. I'm standing at the counter, minding my own business, when I just hear this rich, deep voice demand that I cook him a hot dog because all the ones on the machine are overcooked and look like crap. I glance over and yeah, fair enough. The The hot dogs had been on rotation for about 3 days if I knew Gary, so a fresh batch wasn't out of the question. The problem was, I had no idea where the request had come from. The voice demanded that I get a move on and said that he didn't have all day. And so I leaned over the counter, trying to get a better view of the store, and that's when I saw a little person standing as close to the counter as he could get without face planting. Now, I'll admit I was a little thrown that he'd decided to position himself somewhere that would clearly not be visible to me, but whatever. Now, I apologized profusely and said that I had no idea that he was a little person. And the guy just sort of harumphed and huffed and said that calling him a little person was deeply offensive. And so in my infinite wisdom, I apologized again and said, "I'm sorry, I meant midget." And I saw his face go red with fury, and I knew that I messed up. Now, I scoured my mind. What else did small folk like to be called? Now, this was back in the 80s, so the differences weren't as well known then. And the man explained that he had dwarfism, and so obviously I should refer to him as dwarf. Now, fair enough. I have no problem with that, and I will refer to people however they want. I guess the thing that riled me up is that during my first time in juvie, I took an extremely nasty acid attack to the face, and it left me permanently disfigured and blind in one eye, so I clearly wasn't so intentionally ableist against people with different body types, but that's neither here nor there. I told the dwarf that I would happily make him a new hot dog if he'd head over to the machine with me so I could cook the wiener to his perfect perfection. And somehow, of course, this managed to offend the fella tremendously again, and he began screaming at me in what sounded like a Shakespearean monologue about how he shouldn't have to move, and it was my job to go and cook him a hot dog with all the trimmings and blah blah blah. No, actually, it wasn't. It was a self-service hot dog machine, but I wasn't going to argue. I told him that I'd head over and cook him up the best hot dog he'd ever had. Now, the dwarf replied by saying that it was too late now. I'd screwed everything up, and it was time to face the consequences. In complete shock, I watched as the little man rose to his full height of around 6 foot. At the same time, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sawed-off shotgun. He told me that if I went for the panic alarm or anything like that, he'd blast a hole in my chest the size of a foot-long hot dog. And you know what? Screw it. Screw Gary. I wasn't getting killed over a job that barely paid enough for me to live and forced me to work 5 nights a week at Gary's. And I told the now 6-foot dwarf to chill and emptied the register for him. He filled a bag that he'd produced from nowhere and gave me a very cruel smile and just strutted out of the gas station. Or he almost did. For some reason, he paused to unload a shotgun round into the hot dog station and blasting that thing into pieces, leaving my ears ringing, and then he left. Now, my heart was pounding harder than it had when I'd done 4 lines of, well, never mind. Immediately, I pressed the panic button and I called 911 for good measure. Screw Gary. Those cops could actually wake him up. And so when the cops got here, we discovered a bunch of things. 1, Gary was too cheap to actually buy an outdoor security camera, so that one was actually fake. And so we had absolutely no footage of this fake dwarf leaving the premises. However, the interior cameras did work and I was able to see how he'd tricked me. He'd been kneeling on shoes, positioned in a perfect practice pose, so I had no chance of seeing his real legs. This explains why he didn't want to accompany me to the hot dog machine, though. And hilariously, this fake dwarf had been the suspect in a bunch of local robberies. He'd never fired his weapon before, and you know what got him caught? The fact that he took the time to shoot the crap out of that hot dog oven. Now, they were able to trace that buckshot of the gun to the owner and get his ass busted. He'd robbed enough places that I'm pretty sure that he'd actually die behind bars. What a shame. And as for me, I got my ass absolutely chewed out by Gary for handing over the cash and not risking my life by grabbing the baseball bat under the counter. I quit on the spot. I got my life together and I went back to school. I graduated, then got a degree, and some years later I met a woman that I fell head over heels for. Now imagine how shocked I was when I discovered that she was Gary's daughter, and hated him even more than I did. We originally bonded over drinks, where she shared our glee that he was dead, and now I know I sound like an ass, but you didn't know the man. He wanted me to die rather than hand over $200 or so to a fake dwarf. Screw Gary, screw the fake dwarf. I work in a very lucrative field now, and my life's freaking awesome. And that's why I'm writing to another awesome person, you, let's read. And I hope you enjoyed my story of a bunch of weirdos, at least one of whom nearly murdered me. And if you didn't, well, I know people who will shove a hot dog where the sun don't shine. Have a beautiful day. Hi, Joel. I grew up in Britain, although my parents are French. You'd never know it, though, because I have the most posh, London-sounding accent that a French girl could ever have. This might be because of the school that I went to, or because I left school in college, and I took some time out before university to work as an air hostess. I loved that job and ended up staying in the air for 5 years. Not literally, of course, but you get what I mean. I left sixth form college in 1997, and the story that I'm about to share with you took place in 1999. This was a couple of years before, everything changed with the planes, and security was very different back then. Things were a lot more lax, and it was much easier to get up to high hijinks. For one thing, you could still join the Mile High Club without too much trouble. Not that I ever did that, of course, I honestly would never. I shouldn't joke about that kind of thing, considering the story that I'm about to share with you, or joke about anything, really. So this story took place on the first ever red-eye flight that I was working. I'm sure everyone knows what a red-eye flight is by this point, but if by some small chance you don't, it's a flight, generally a shorter one, that takes place at night and often involves the passengers sleeping for the duration. If you take the red-eye, you're meant to stay quiet, calm, and well-behaved. I can't remember if kids were flat out banned from our red-eye flights, but I don't ever remember any kids or babies on the handful that I worked. Now this was 27 years ago, so bear with me. I've not worked as an air hostess for almost as long, and I haven't thought about planes in a long time. From what I can recall, the plane, run by some long bankrupt airline that you probably never heard of, was divided into 2 sections. The front section, closer to the cockpit, was for passengers who wanted to stay quiet and chill but weren't intending to sleep. It was the cheaper option and usually the busier one. Then the back of the plane, in reverse of the usual, was sort of the first class section, except this was for people who wanted or needed to sleep, so it was filled with bed seats. I was working up front, which suited me just fine because I didn't want to tiptoe around snoring old businessmen. And the sleeping area always smelled like farts too, so that was lovely. A red-eye typically doesn't have as many flight attendants as a regular flight, or at least it didn't back then. I think there were just 3 of us on that flight, although I could be misremembering. What I do remember is that I was up front, obviously, and my dear, queer, gentle friend Adam was working the sleeper section. Do you remember H from Steps? I don't know if Steps was that big in the United States, so maybe you never knew him, Joel, but if not, Google him and stick a picture up on screen if you can. Adam looked just like H from Steps, only he was a lot calmer, quieter, and more gentle than H, who always seemed like he had the energy of 50 men. Now make sure you Google H from Steps and not his real name, Ian Watkins, otherwise you might get that nunce from Lost Prophets, another singer who unfortunately shared a name. Now, he did some really, really terrible things, and you should do a true crime story about him one day, actually. That'd be actually very interesting. He was shanked in prison recently, too. Died. What a tragedy. Now, anyways, Adam was like a really calm and gentle H from Steps, and I promise this is important eventually. Partly it's important because the villain of this story, who we'll call Ian, looked kind of like the Lost Prophets guy. Although he wasn't really famous at the time and we didn't know he was a major criminal, so maybe I'm just misremembering. I'll call him Ian anyway because nearly every guy called Ian I've ever met was a proper prick, if you get me. Except for my cousin Ian, who's an actual right laugh. So anyways, back to the red-eye. Because I was working at the front of the plane, most of the passengers ate late-night airline food, and that meant that it was my job to collect up the trays with their rubbish on them. Now, I did this on autopilot, pun intended, sticking them on my trolley with a little "thank you, sir," or "thank you, ma'am," or "thank you, lovely," if they were some old biddy who was so wrinkled that they could have been a lad or a lass, or how do I put this tactfully? Someone who was very, very large and made it impossible to tell their gender. Now anyways, you had to be really careful about that back then. Christ, I mean, I feel bad for air hostesses in the 2020s, and I bet there had to have been some actual moments where a 20-year-old sweetheart had called a bearded passenger sir and been chewed out for not recognizing that they were a pretty princess. Oh Christ, I shouldn't have had those last couple of glasses of wine before writing you this email. Now anyways, I got my trolley full of trays and crap to the center of the plane and began chucking away the plastic boxes that the dinner had come in. And that's when I noticed it. A napkin with writing scrawled across the whole thing. "I know what you did on that plane," they'd written. And then a crude picture of what was definitely supposed to be me because, well, I could just tell, okay? Now, there had only been about 7 or 8 passengers who'd had dinner, so the note couldn't have come from too many people. I don't know why I even cared because I hadn't done anything on any plane by that point, but the drawing had been very rude and insulting, and I was young, so I guess I felt kind of threatened by it. It didn't take long for me to notice Ian, even in the low, dim lights of the red-eye flight. Now, he was a guy about my age with slicked back hair and a goatee that made him look like a proper wrong'un. Now, he kept giving me the evils, looking at me like I was a bit of dog poo on the sole of his shoe, but then also sometimes like he wanted to lick it. Now, I'm going to stop this comparison there because I'm squeaking myself out, but you get the idea. I was disgusted by him, but he still wanted a piece of that, you know? And so I guess he was watching when I was looking, and he saw me looking, and then he started calling me over and asking for things like, "Hey girl, can I get a bottle of water?" Or, "Got any napkins? I seem to have lost mine." And my favorite, "Way up, whoa lass, can you handle these nuts for me? I haven't had any complimentary airline peanuts yet. So, can you get them?" And that's what he said, word for word, and I swear on the Bible about it. As an air hostess back then, at the dodgy flight company I worked for, you were taught to always smile, be as flirty as possible, and take as much crap from passengers as you could tolerate. I remember once, before this red-eye, I got chewed out for telling a passenger off after he touched my butt, and he said it was an accident and apologized, so apparently I was in the wrong for muttering perv under my breath as I walked off. Now anyway, after I gave Ian his nuts, he called me back again about 10 minutes later and said that they really were salty, and then he asked me if I like salty things, which I pointedly ignored. And so he just laughed and said he needed another bottle of water and asked if I could be a good girl and go fetch him one. Of course, I did just that. What I didn't realize was that Ian got right out of his seat and followed me into the middle of the plane, where we kept things like bottled water and complimentary peanuts. The bathrooms were nearby, so at first I wasn't alarmed by the sensation that someone had followed me. Unfortunately, it was Ian, and he wasn't headed to the bathroom. Instead, he grabbed me, pinned me against the wall, and shoved some kind of hand towel against my mouth to gag me. And then he leaned in close and started whispering in my ear about what a terrible person I was. He didn't say it exactly like that, obviously. He said some proper vile stuff. Stuff that now, as a grandmother in my early 50s, I'd give a lad a good lick in the dick for. But back then, though, it was just a little wee thing and I was terrified. I started crying almost immediately, and Ian was all cruel and callous, saying that I brought this on myself, and he said I'd betrayed him after what I did on the last flight, and asked how I was okay with throwing away 7 years of our relationship. And that's when I realized that this guy somehow believed that I was someone totally different, specifically his girlfriend or ex-girlfriend, who was also apparently an air hostess and had cheated on him on a flight. I didn't know it at the time, but his brain was absolutely fried from a cocktail of alcohol, MDMA, and coke, which I guess explains his temporary insanity. And things escalated when he tried to force me into the bathroom, pushing the hand towel so deep into my throat that I couldn't even try to scream. None of the passengers were turning around, and it was just me and Ian and a curtain separating us from the sleeper section. Now, the best I managed was slapping the wall, trying to do some type of SOS. I got maybe 2 short slaps in before Ian grabbed me between the legs over my skirt and squeezed in a way that made it very clear that he'd do worse if I kept going. I guess my beloved friend H heard the slapping because suddenly I saw all 5'5" of him peeking through the curtain, and then holy God, he stormed toward Ian, and then holy God, he yanked him off of me. My gentle, sweet buddy H didn't hesitate. He smashed his forehead into Ian's face, and the crunch of a bone sounded like a gunshot in that silent plane. And then H was yelling that a man was trying to assault his colleague. And H absolutely bodied him. It turned out he was a brown belt in Krav Maga. He floored Ian in seconds, tied him up with plastic ties, and even broke bones in his foot when Ian tried to kick out. Ian spent the next 3 hours hog-tied in an out-of-order bathroom next to a toilet full of poop. We radioed ahead, and police were waiting at Heathrow. This Ian guy was arrested immediately, and after that, things changed. I became more cautious, I went to therapy eventually, and I gained a whole new respect for H. I stayed in the job for another 3 years and then left, and life moved on. But I'll never forget the terror of that night, or the man who saved me. I'm a 35-year-old woman, and I work as a nurse. I've done so for the last 10 years now. Now, I doubt it's a career that you can really relate to, being a literary expert and linguistic YouTuber, but it feels like we live in entirely different worlds altogether, although apologies if I'm wrong. Now, maybe you have family who worked in the profession, and I'll admit I'm not a die-hard regular viewer, but I love it when your videos come on autoplay and actually help me sleep. Some friends of mine encouraged me to email this story in, so I hope I'm making the right call in doing so, and I think it was scary as HE double hockey sticks anyways. So this story takes place when I was 25. I'd already done a degree, so I was on a fast-track program at nursing school, a little 2-year qualification. Now this meant that there was a lot of the on-the-job training early on, which suited me just fine. I've been in school since I was like 4 years old, and I was eager to put the books away and start emptying bedpans or inserting suppositories into people's butts. And maybe the whole sometimes saving people's lives things. I don't know, I forget why I got into the profession. Now anyways, as a part of my training, I was required to spend 2 months working on a number of different wards. Really, they just wanted to toughen us up and throw us into the deep end. I'd already done a stint in the pediatric floor, an oncology floor, and a burns unit. Now, it was absolutely insane, particularly the burns unit, honestly, and I'm pretty sure I could spend a whole story talking about what various types of burns do to the human body. And I would traumatize your listeners more than half the serial killer or stalker stories did that they might have heard. Now, I was pretty relieved when my next assignment seemed like the administration were giving me a break. Now, I was set to spend 2 months working on a coma ward. I mean, okay, yeah, this was emotionally pretty devastating, but it was pretty different from consoling a guy whose face had been permanently disfigured by an electrical fire and whose nerve endings would never, ever stop reminding him of this fact, let alone the visual aspect. But just thinking about it now, and this one guy in particular, it honestly breaks my heart, and I'm not going to talk about him or even think about it. Instead, let's talk about comatose people, and the majority of these comatose people were old. We had some younger people, but the bays that I was assigned as a junior trainee consisted of old men and old women. Now this coma floor was surprisingly busy because during the day there were a lot of visitors, and this surprised me as you always hear about loved ones being abandoned since they'd been in a coma for a long time, but maybe it's something to do with the area that I live in. Almost every coma patient had visitors almost every day. And then there was the cleaning, the massaging, the daily care. Now, it was pretty chill work, but hard and important work at the same time. And after a week, I was asked if I could cover the night shift for 3 nights. And of course, I said yes because the night shift on a coma ward is honestly notoriously quiet, and I had a bunch of studying to catch up on. There were only 3 of us on shift during that 3-day block, and I think there was supposed to be a 4th nurse, but they had actually called in sick and I never saw him. There was Yvonne, the charge nurse, and Soa, a junior nurse who'd passed her training. Not that this is in any way relevant, but Soa was one of the most beautiful girls I'd ever seen before or since, and part of me wondered if this is why she worked on that coma floor, to avoid the inevitable harassment that would have come her way on a bunch of other floors. Now maybe I was just thinking too hard, or maybe I was just jealous. I was not the kind of woman who was going to win any beauty pageants or fit into any Met Gala outfits. I'm happy to add, though, that 10 years on the job has cost me 120 pounds, and I couldn't be happier. I still can't do anything about my piggy-looking face though, but oh well. I soon found out that working the night shift on that coma floor wasn't the quiet, relaxing chill-out zone that I expected it to be. The work was no harder than I expected. It was the usual emptying catheters and colostomy bags, taking patients' obs, that sort of thing, charting, etc., checking the machines were functioning and that nobody had secretly died while the machines happily beeped away. It was the human silence. None of the comatose patients snored. You couldn't even hear them breathing over the sound of the machinery, and a handful of them couldn't even breathe without medical aid, and I guess their loved ones couldn't bring themselves to switch off the machines. I don't even want to think about having to make that choice myself. It was my first night shift, and I was around 3 hours into the adventure. Yvonne and Soa had disappeared somewhere, and I assumed that they both headed toward the end of the ward, but I hadn't seen them leave, and they hadn't said anything. So it was just me, sitting at the nurse's station, trying and failing to force the contents of my textbook into my brain. Now, frustrated at my inability to learn, I glanced up to check that the immovable patient hadn't moved. Now imagine my shock when I saw a figure, dressed all in black, standing over the woman in the far right bed off the bay in front of the nurse's station. The figure was dressed entirely in black, not a cloak or some kind of death garb, but black workout pants, a black hoodie, and most notably black leather gloves. The figure was leaning down, whispering something into the woman's ear, who continued to sleep the sleep of the dead in her coma. And I convinced myself that the other nurses were pranking me and that this had to be Soa in disguise. It wasn't anything remotely like I expected from either of those two, though, and I think deep down I knew that the figure was a man. There was no way that I was even willing to consider any other possibilities, though, as I left the nurse's station and stepped into Bay 5. I called out to the figure saying that I wasn't falling for that prank, and he continued whispering into the old woman's ear as if he hadn't even heard me. Obviously, deep down I knew that this wasn't something Yvonne or Soa would do. Now, one of the orderlies or the nursing assistants, maybe, and some of those guys could be freaking weirdos. I became even more certain that the figure wasn't Yvonne, who was nearing 300 pounds and was quite clearly not this slender black-clad figure, or Soa. Now this was reaffirmed by two sets of footsteps coming from my distant left, heading from the direction of Bay 1, and Yvonne's voice calling out in the stage whisper that we adopted in the coma ward. Now she asked who the heck I was talking to and what was going on. Now, I looked up, hoping that that black-clad figure had to be some sort of figment of my imagination. But of course not. He was no longer leaning down to whisper into the old woman's ear, though. He turned to face me, and I could see that under his black hoodie, he wore a black garment, sort of like a balaclava, but thin and not made of wool. I'm not even sure what those are really called. I started pointing at the black-clad figure who in my mind I had already taken to just calling death, and I started muttering and stuttering, trying to explain that someone was in here, but I have no idea what actually came out of my mouth. Almost nothing coherent, I'm pretty sure. Now, it must have been enough to alert Yvonne to something, though, because she started freaking out, and so did Soa. Not in a "there's a ghost on the coma ward, death has come for us all" type of way, though. She charged forward and began sort of whisper yelling at the intruder to identify himself immediately because security was already on their way. I don't think this was true, but he didn't know that. Yvonne ran forward and used her considerable bulk to manhandle this black hoodie guy away from the patients and into the corridor. That's when he began screaming that we wouldn't keep him from his grandmother, that we were stopping him from being able to say goodbye, and that the angels in his head would melt the flesh from this fat, unclean demon, which clearly meant Yvonne. Now, I was frozen on the spot, like a complete useless fool. Soa had already ducked behind the nurse's station and called security, God bless her. Meanwhile, Yvonne was furious, and I'll never forget what she said. "You can call me fat, and you can call me a demon, but nobody calls me unclean," she yelled. And halfway to the elevator, the door opened and a handful of security guards emerged, followed by a neurology doctor. Now, this couldn't have been the security that Soa called because they appeared far too quickly. Now, the doctor quickly explained that this patient had been in an overflow area suffering a head injury that didn't appear too severe, but something had caused him to make his way to the ICU coma ward. Now, we later found out that his grandmother had died on this very floor after falling into a coma when the patient was just a child. Now, more gently now, Yvonne escorted the patient toward the doctor in the elevator, and the patient paused and removed his hood and that mask thing that he was wearing. And I don't know if it was the removal of that mask that caused everything to go to hell, but something did. The patient turned and stared directly at me. He made perfect, direct eye contact, and suddenly, blood began dripping from his nose, his ears, and most violently, his eye sockets. And then as I watched, the patient, whose name I still didn't know, had the most violent seizure I'd ever seen and collapsed directly to the floor. Everything felt like slow motion, but sped up at the same time, and the doctor pronounced that black-clad man dead right there on the scene as they tried to work on him. Now, the short version of this mild concussion he'd received had triggered some type of aneurysm in his brain, a weakening of his brain tissue that nobody could have even possibly predicted. Now, I'd love to say that the comatose woman he whispered to had made a full recovery, but she remained in her coma for another couple of years before also passing. The whole thing could have put me off being a nurse, but it didn't. It reminded me that so many people need our help, people who might appear sinister at first glance, people who are at the end of their lives, everyone. We're all vulnerable to the inevitability of death, and I feel like it's my calling to try and help that transition feel a little easier for as many people as I can. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Go check it out, as all the links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, stop projecting. You remind me of my mean dad and my mean ex-boyfriend. Hey, Let's Read. I've been a fan for a long time. You're my favorite go-to sleep aid and my favorite listening while exercise guy. Two sides of an interesting coin. My husband listens sometimes too, and I recently was lamenting to him that I didn't have a scary story to send in to you, because I'd kind of love to hear you narrate something I wrote. And then my husband said, "Babe, what about the time we almost got murdered by that crazy guy when we were going to Barbara's wedding?" And I'm thinking, oh yeah, we did almost get murdered by some crazy guy, didn't we? So it turns out that I do have a story to send to you after all. And it's about the time I almost got murdered by a crazy guy. Now, spoiler, he didn't succeed in the murdering. But for some context, I'm a woman and I was in my 20s when this happened. We were driving across the country to attend my sister Barbara's wedding. And I'll be honest, I can't stand her husband-to-be, Brandon, and I was a bit grumpy about having to make a 3-day journey to the East Coast in the first place. I feel like it's okay to insult Brandon since he later cheated on Barbara and divorced her, so screw you if you're listening, Brandon. Now, we were in our 20s, so this must have been maybe 1997, I think. Back before we had smartphones and GPS in every car, on every phone, and we had to rely on those horrible, huge paper maps that always tore when you were trying to unfold them. And I'm so glad that those things aren't necessary anymore. We were driving down a pretty straight, long highway, but for some reason, hubby had decided to unfurl the map to see what was coming up, I guess. And when he told me to pull over, which seemed pretty safe since we hadn't seen a car for miles, and there was a pretty flat verge to pull onto, I was kind of puzzled. And then he pointed to the map, at really nothing to be precise. And then he pointed across the desert a little ways, and I saw what he was getting at. There was a town, or part of one anyway, and it looked a bit run down, that wasn't on our map. and we made sure to get the latest revision. Now, this would happen sometimes with certain landmarks or areas. If they were demolished or no longer relevant, then they'd just simply be taken off the map. And so the town, which was clearly some sort of ghost town, wasn't marked down on the map because presumably nobody would have any reason to go there, and so there was no point wasting the ink to print an indicator that the town used to be there, I guess. Now, naturally, this meant that hubby and I both wanted to check out this town that wasn't worth including on the map. Now, our 4x4 was pretty robust, and we were on a fairly smooth area of the desert, so we felt comfortable driving off-road a ways until we were closer to said town. Now, it wasn't too hot that day either, so we walked the remaining 20 minutes. When we got closer, it seemed more apparent that the town was a little more complete than we'd first thought. However, we were kind of nervous because there were signs up on the remaining broken-down buildings claiming that they'd been condemned by a company that I forgot the name of now, by order of the state. So we explored with nervous trepidation. It was eerie, seeing this place in the middle of nowhere that looked like it had just been abandoned probably in the 1950s. Now, I could tell it was probably around then based on the dates on the signs and just what it generally looked like. Now, my husband called me over to this one building which appeared to be some sort of mining office. The door was missing, so we were able to enter, being as careful as we could with the floor. Now, he showed me a metal sign that talked about how the miners should report to the foreman if they're experiencing dizziness or nausea, and that while there was no evidence of some natural gas leak, the company, goddamn, I do wish I remembered the name, wanted to watch out for its employees. Now, I made some kind of remark about how these days they just tell the miners to take an aspirin and keep inhaling the asbestos or whatever it was, and my husband laughed at me for mentioning asbestos as natural gas, and this sent me into fits of laughter. And I guess that's what alerted the guy, or woke him up, or whatever. I just heard this sort of cry of, "They're back!" and then heard these heavy footsteps coming running from what sounded like a few buildings away. Now, hubby and I looked at each other, not sure what to do, stepped outside, my heart was pounding. Now, my husband did have an open carry permit at the time and had his gun on a visible holster on his shoulder, so we hoped that this by itself would diffuse whatever situation was about to arise. Now, coming up Main Street of this ghost town was this tall, wiry man with a big, bushy beard. Now, he was very chunky for someone who looked like he'd been living off the land for years, and wore this biker's jacket that had probably been black once, but was caked brown with so much dust you couldn't tell. He also wore torn jeans that weren't much cleaner, and weirdly though, I noticed that his boots were absolutely spotless, like he polished them every day. And it made me think that he was some sort of ex-military guy, and shining his boots was the one thing that had stuck in his mind. The guy started yelling at us about how he knew that we were company men. Yes, men, even though, I'm a woman, and we'd finally come to try and force him out. Now, we insisted that we had no idea what he was talking about, then we weren't with the company, and we just stumbled upon the town and decided to take a quick peek at what was going on with these ruins. Now, this man comes forward, and my husband reached for his gun. Now, the guy barely even seemed to register it or care as my hubby unholstered it, although he did stop a few feet away from us, so maybe that was for protection. Who knows? Now, it was hard to tell, given the insane rant that he went on next. He started yelling about how the town had been evacuated in the 50s when he was a boy of 18 who just started working in the mines like he dreamed of all of his life. No way was he giving that up, and he refused to leave. And he found a way to get down into those mines and proudly announced that he'd continue to work down there until there was no more coal veins to tap. Now, he said that over time they evacuated the townsfolk in big trucks, and he knew that they took them into the tunnels under the town. He said that the claims of some gas leak was a total lie, and there was definitely no carbon monoxide in the air because look at him, he's fine. And somehow I didn't see this guy as the poster child for someone who doesn't have mild carbon monoxide poisoning. And then he offered to take us down into those tunnels, where he could show us the remains of the experiments that they'd done down there. He begins to rant about how they tried to fuse people with the rocks and create soldiers out of the rocks and all sorts of other insane crap involving experimenting on people with the rocks. We politely declined his offer to accompany him down into those tunnels, figuring that the only rock that we'd be encountering is the one that he'd used to bash our heads in. Now, this enraged him so instantly and suddenly that my husband didn't even have time to flick the safety off. This hobo charged him and sent the gun flying out of his hand, and then he pushed him to the ground and started choking him out. Now, my husband was a newly minted cop, and he was a bit of a gym bro, so he wasn't exactly some pushover. But this large old hobo drifter had him pinned and was choking him so bad that my husband genuinely could not pull the guy's hands from his throat. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know where the gun had been knocked to, and I couldn't just tackle this dude. But then it hit me. There were rocks all over the path, and I grabbed one that looked like just the right size, not to kill him, but to send him falling back, and threw it straight at his head. Now, I expected it to hit him in the temple and knock him sideways maybe, or disorient him, but my aim was slightly off, and I winced as the rock connected with the man's jaw, causing a very loud crack and his bottom jaw to just kind of go limp. Now, I took this change to now barrel into him like some football player or something and knock him off of my husband, who had already started to loosen the guy's grip on his throat. Now, we turned around and ran for it. I've never ran so fast or so frantically in my life. My husband and I stayed hand in hand to stop each other from slipping on the desert sand as we ran back to our vehicle. Now, I guess this transient found my husband's gun because we heard the sound of it going off, which thankfully seemed to come from nowhere near us. We reached the vehicle, got in, peeled out of there, and then just drove and drove and drove until we found the next rest stop and could call the cops. Now, my husband, being a police officer himself, explained that he was now off duty, obviously, and his personal weapon had been acquired by our assailant, so if they were going to go to that ghost town, they might want to consider the suspect an armed and dangerous one. Now, we waited at the rest stop for 8 hours until an officer arrived. The nearest town was some ways away, and it had taken them a long old while to reach the abandoned town. When they got there was no sign of this guy despite searching all the buildings. They did manage to retrieve my husband's firearm, which they did have to take in for evidence and examine, and they also said that there was no evidence of any entrance into any of the tunnels, and explained that the town had been evacuated back in the 1950s, like the man had claimed, due to a genuine gas leak in those mines. Now, we stayed at the adjoining motel at the rest stop, which put us out of schedule, and it meant that we were almost late for Barbara's wedding, and frankly, I think missing her wedding would have caused more threatening behavior than the hobo ever could. I do wonder what became of that guy. Oh, he's probably obviously dead by now, as he was an old man back in the 90s, but you never know. Maybe huffing all that carbon monoxide or being part of his imaginary rock experiments means he's still out there somewhere, ranting about being evicted by the company. Good evening, let's read. Well, probably afternoon for you, if it's evening for me. You see, I live in a country in Europe. I won't say exactly where because even after all these years, I could get into trouble for speaking out against my own government. The kind of trouble that costs you a pound of flesh, if you know what I mean. Our ruling has always been dictatorial, but it was worse back then. Back then is around 50 years ago when I was just out of my teenage years. Now, perhaps you've heard of Centralia, an abandoned town in Pennsylvania that's, from what I understand, is always on fire. Underground, anyways, and I assume you've heard of it. It's a very famous tale here in Europe and inspired a lot of fiction and art. Not every town is as lucky as Centralia when it comes to awareness and the treatment of its residents, though. Now, I'm sure they don't feel that way. I know that many of them felt forced out of their homes, and I sympathize deeply. And when I say lucky, I of course also don't mean that they experienced any kind of luck. What I mean is that there are some towns where terrible things happen to cause them to become abandoned, and governments such as ours will cover it up and force the residents to go and find new locations to live, with only the smallest stipend to cover the cost of relocation. And this is what happened to my town when I was 23. Now, obviously, I cannot name the town because I cannot name the country, but you'd have to dig pretty deeply to find any meaningful records or evidence of what went on anyway. I made the mistake in the past of talking about this too loudly and too frequently and came dangerously close to shooting myself in the foot, as they say. And so, for a bit of background about our town, it wasn't even a town really, it was sort of a tiny village tucked into the mountains. Now we knew that the other side of the mountain range was riddled with mines and various mineral mining operations, but as far as we were aware, the land beneath our village was solid and no mining operations were conducted anywhere near our place of living. Now this seemed to be true. We never saw construction vehicles or knew of any mines nearby. And then one day, a supposed construction company moved into the village to build what they called a refuge into the mountainside. They wouldn't explain to us exactly what this was or who it was a refuge for, but it involved some machinery that I'd never seen for basic construction, like a bore drill with tank-like tracks to drill into the mountainside. Now, 3 days after the company moved in, we were all awoken by what felt like an earthquake and rumbling under our feet that caused pictures to fall off of walls and plates to fall out of cabinets. Now, we had never once had an earthquake in the area, not once, and I don't even know if they really work like that halfway up on a mountain. But we were all certain that we'd felt an earthquake as we came running out of our houses. At this time, it was just past 5 a.m. The sun was starting to rise, and some of us were still in our night clothes. And I remember one of my neighbors sobbing and screaming that the rapture was coming. It was honestly insanity. We began to gather in the street when suddenly we had to clear out of the way. A bunch of the construction company's vehicles were speeding through the village and down the road. Now, I couldn't help but notice that the drill wasn't there, although even if it was, it would have moved at a much slower pace. Now, we didn't receive answers for 2 days. The earthquake had broken our ill-maintained telephone poles, and we were essentially stranded, left to pick up the pieces and clean up our houses after the quake. Now, eventually, the technicians came in to fix the telephone poles, including a much-needed upgrade, and with them came a representative from that construction company. There had been an explosion in the mines, he said, and when we questioned him on what he meant by mines, he quickly changed his story. The explosion had been in the refuge that they were constructing, and he was just used to talking about mines, so he'd made a slip of the tongue. And of course, this is when I first got suspicious. Now, this man explained that the mountainside had become unstable and our little town was in danger of possibly a landslide. He said that the government had agreed to offer us all a small stipend to relocate, and that the new housing site around the base of the mountain had enough unsold properties for all of us to move in for cheap. Now, of course, we later discovered that the materials used to build the new housing development was extremely subpar, and surprise, surprise, the housing development had been built by the same construction company who were building the refuge. Now, a few days after the construction company representative had left, promising that we'd all receive relocation packets in the mail, I decided to sneak to the construction site. Now, imagine my surprise. Instead of an abandoned site and signs of some explosion, there were 2 armed guards and clear evidence that the construction work was still underway. There was no way that I was risking getting shot to death. Curiosity killed the cat, I like to say, so it was a case of having to relocate with my parents and the rest of the town. For something that wasn't our fault, and it sure ended up costing us more than the government offered. But like I said, our government isn't the one that allows you to just complain. Life went on, but I could never get our old town out of my head. I developed this theory, though, that there was no accidental explosion. It was a rigged explosion designed to cause us to leave, and that there was no refuge, whatever that meant, but they discovered veins of some kind of ore in the tunnels in our part of the mountain. But mining there would have been dangerous with a populated village, even if it had only about 50 or so people. Much easier to fake a disaster and force us to relocate. Now, I moved on and moved to a different part of the country. My parents had passed on not long after we relocated and caught in some fatal car accident caused by a drunk driver at the wheel, who, of course, had the pleasure of surviving. I had nothing keeping me in this new housing estate. No memories, no connections, and always been a loner, always kept to myself, and I'd been homeschooled and had never bothered to make friends my age. So I traveled the country for a while and then settled down far from where I grew up. But still, the old town was on my mind, and so one day I decided to track down some of the families that I'd grown up with just to check in, except I couldn't. For most of them, it was like they'd simply disappeared. I found a handful of obituaries, names that I recognized, and in one case an entire family of 4 who'd passed within a period of 2 years. I managed to get a hold of a few families, and not one of them wanted to hear from me. They didn't say so, of course. They were all far too polite for that, but you could tell that they wanted to get me off the phone as soon as possible. One person even got pretty angry at the fact that I'd managed to track them down until I explained that they were in the phone book, and their answer is that I'll have to rectify that. Other than all feeling very hostile, the few villagers that I spoke to all had one other thing in common. They all sounded kind of sick. They all had coughs, every one of them, and they all had the same raspy quality to their voices. Now, I can't entirely explain this, but the most logical explanation to me is that whatever that fault line they opened when they created the explosion to access the mine, it unleashed some type of fumes or burned some type of material that affected almost all of the population. I made my final call in 1992, and the next day I received a knock at the door. Now, I answered to be greeted by two government officials who flashed some official badges at me. They wore these black suits, sunglasses, and to me were genuinely men in black. Only they weren't here to silence me about anything fun like aliens. Instead, I was warned to stop harassing the families that I'd lived alongside in the housing estate. And finally, they warned that if I knew what was good for me, I would forget that I ever grew up in a mountain town and that I'd certainly never been in proximity to some explosion of any sort. And then one of the agents brushed his jacket aside, revealing a firearm, and I was suitably silenced at that point. Whatever happened in my town will forever remain a mystery. While there are mysteries surrounding Centralia, my tale proves that it could be a lot worse. Not that it's some competition, but to me, both truly were tragedies. The story that I want to send you happened in the early 2000s, when me and my friends were a bit more reckless and crazy than we are now. These days we prefer a quiet beer on the lawn while the kids play in the pool. Our days of exploring random abandoned towns and desert death traps are over. It's like they say, getting old sucks, but everyone's doing it. Now, I can't remember which one of us had the bright idea. There was me, my name's Carl, my friend Richie, Sam, and Carson. It was probably Sam. He was always the one with crazy ideas about outdoor adventures. And I just don't want to 100% put the blame at his feet just in case. You know, all I know is that it wasn't me who suggested that we become wilderness explorers with absolutely no experience or knowledge. Now, I was all okay, so we just gonna do a bunch of reading and buy all this equipment on some meager budget and stuff, and whoever's idea it was turned to me and said, no, we're just gonna do it. Okay, I know it wasn't Carson who suggested it actually, and you'll see why later. Now, Carson's the hero of this story, and you should know that straight up. I don't think he's paid for a single beer when he's been with us for the last 23 years. He's a legend of a man and also a very quiet fella. Now anyway, the culprit, who I'm getting increasingly certain was Sam, explained that there was a ghost town in the desert, just 50 miles from the Arizona town that we all lived in. Now I said, you mean a haunted town? And I was only half joking because I didn't really know what a ghost town really was. Now Sam, oh yeah, sorry Sam, you're getting the blame and I remembered it was you. He responds, no you dingus, a ghost town is one of those old towns, usually from maybe the Wild West, abandoned when they realized there was no gold in them thar hills, or, you know, pillaged by bandits or other folks. No, I'm not sure he said exactly that, then there was probably a lot more slurs and cursing since it was Sam, but that was the gist of it. And so we set off, the four of us completely unprepared to explore a desert town 50 miles from home. At least we brought plenty of water and had the foresight to pack warm clothes for those chilly desert nights. Our plan was to reach the ghost town by nightfall, sleep in the car, and then explore by day. Now we'd been driving for around 40 miles when we saw a group of guys with trucks who'd pitched some tents around. From the looks of things, they'd been living in the desert for a bit, and they'd set up a little bit of a commune or something. They looked like good-time lads, you know, kind of like us really. Our age, quietly laughing and just drinking beers around a campfire. Now, they must have noticed that we'd slowed as we passed them, and one of them waved for us to stop. Now, I was the driver, so I did and wound down the window. The guy invited us to chill with them because they hardly ever saw anyone come out this way, and certainly not fellas their age. They looked a bit hillbilly, but I mean, really, we were from southern Arizona, so were we. And we piled out of the car and perched ourselves on nearby crates and logs while our new friends kindly offered us some beers. Now, we offered them some cans in exchange, but they weren't having any of it. We were their guests. They were fun, really jokey, honestly, and made us laugh a whole bunch. Now, Sam especially seemed to fit in well with them, being the hick that he is, and only Carson seemed to keep to himself, just offering a polite smile and laugh occasionally. Now, while Carson was always the quiet one, he was usually a little more sociable than this, and I wondered if something was bothering him. It soon came up as to why we were driving through the desert at sunset, since we were clearly locals heading away from town. Sam, without a thought, told them that we'd heard about this ghost town nearby, and we wanted to explore when the sun came up. Now, immediately, these desert dwellers started putting on some fake 80s gas station attendant voices, like, "Y'all don't want to go down there. That place is cursed. You kids stay away from that town, year. There's nothing to be found but death." And the best one, the guy who told a story about how the town was abandoned because it had fallen victim to a skindigo, which is sort of like a Wendigo meets a skinwalker apparently, and only happens when the dog man has sex with a Jersey Devil. Now, it's a pretty epic story, and it caused them to break character and descend into fits of laughter. They did tell us, however, that the town was better explored at night if we had some pretty powerful flashlights and equipment. In the daytime, all we'd see is rotting bits of wood and remnants of a long-abandoned town, but if you go there at night, you'll see fireflies and feel this whole atmosphere that gives the place a completely different angle. And now that I think about it, they were really insistent that we explore at night, and maybe that should have been a red flag. The group suddenly announced that since the sun had set and it was starting to get cold, they'd be going to their tents, so they wished us luck in our explorations. They said to say hello if we ever came out this way again and encountered them. And so we got back in my vehicle, this fairly new SUV that I was very proud of at the time, and headed the final 10 miles in to the ghost town. Sam was riding shotgun, which meant that I didn't get a chance to talk to Carson, who'd been up front with me for most of the ride. Sam insisted on blasting 80s rock through my stereo system, so no conversation of any kind was really possible. Finally, we could see the rotting logs that made up the remains of the entrance to the ghost town. We stopped the vehicle about 20 feet away and just straight up began walking towards the town. Carson stopped us. He told us that he actually had a bit of experience with wilderness survival, and having been quite a big player in the Scouts in his youth, he didn't make it sound that gay, he asked us if we'd let him go first. Now, I took the opportunity to ask what was wrong, and he said that he'd been getting odd vibes from those guys back at that tent. Now, I was surprised. They seemed fine, and then he explained that their trucks had only recently been parked there. They had fairly deep tire tracks that he noticed, and he also said that he'd spotted a number of shotguns and rifles just lying around inside their tents and in the truck beds. I hadn't seen any of this, and to this day this is why Carson is our goddamn hero. And so he approached first, and we followed behind him. His flashlight was mostly sweeping the sandy floor for some reason, and every time we tried to ask him anything, he just sort of shush us. Now, he seemed to study the two poles serving as the town's entrance for quite a while, especially shining his flashlight in between them. When he was satisfied, he took a few steps inside and then stopped. He pointed to two small poles stretched further across the entrance, and then told us to look at this. He shone his flashlight between them, and then there, glinting in the light, was very clear metal wire. It didn't look like the garrote wire or piano wire or anything that would slice your head or feet off, but it certainly was some kind of tripwire designed to do something. "We're leaving. Now," Carson said, and none of us disagreed with him. And then as we turned to exit through the entrance poles, all at once, I felt something bite into my ankle. Now, at first, I thought it was a damn snake had gotten to me, but then the pain grew worse and spread across my whole ankle, and I started screaming in pain. Carson shone the flashlight down, and I'd stepped on a goddamn animal trap. It looked like something designed to trap a coyote or a fox, so nothing as lethal or life-ruining as a bear trap, but it still hurt like a bitch mother effer, and I reached down to try and pry it off of my ankle, but Carson instantly stopped me and said that that would probably increase the blood loss, and we had a fairly long drive to the nearest medical service even if we put the pedal to the metal. It also meant that I couldn't be the one to drive my precious SUV, which was hell unto itself. And for some reason, in the haze of all my pain that I felt, I let Sam take the wheel. Carson couldn't drive, and Richie said that he wanted to sit in the back with me because he apparently had some first aid techniques that would help me out. Now, this turned out to be that he had a bunch of oxy with him, which most definitely wasn't his prescription, and he kept promising me that he wasn't some addict or anything, but at that moment, I didn't care. He slipped me a tablet, and slowly the pain from my trap-snapped ankle started to ease. I asked him if I could have another, and after some soul-searching, he gave me half. Now, meanwhile, Sam was proving to be a pretty competent nighttime desert driver, and Carson was plotting the best route to the nearest walk-in clinic or hospital once we got back to town. Then up ahead, Sam yelled that he saw those guys from before and maybe they could help us. Except immediately, Carson told him to floor it. The guys, who'd clearly seen us coming, were scrambling out of their tents into one of the beat-up trucks, and all of them seemed to be packing old-ass, ill-maintained shotguns and rifles. But even a crappy rifle can put a bullet in you. Sam, to his credit, absolutely gunned it like he was set to win the Dakar rally. And I mean, damn, with those skills, I'm convinced that maybe he could have been a rally driver, just not in my SUV. Now, we were pretty big distance from the desert hillbilly camp when the first shot rang out. I had no idea where it went because you'd have to have been an award-winning sniper to hit a moving target at that distance. And then they left off a few more shots, and again, nothing came close to hitting us, thankfully. And finally, they released some volley of shots that seemed to be fired into the air, maybe in anger or intimidation, and I think they knew that they'd lost us. My heart was pounding, I was sweating, and thanks to Sam and mostly to Carson, we made our way back to our town, and I was able to receive medical treatment. We'd done the right thing by not removing the trap, and I was kind of still high on the oxy, so I was a little paranoid that they'd start asking about that. They didn't, and later Richie told me that nobody would have begrudged me for indulging in a little illegal perk when I had a coyote trap around my foot. While I was in the hospital, accompanied by Richie, Carson and Sam went to the local police station, who knew us from some of our infamous high school antics but kind of liked us all the same, and they explained the situation, and the cops told them that they thought that they knew who these boys were. A group of brothers, a cousin, and a friend from a nearby trailer park who all had warrants out for their arrests. Now, nothing serious, but they did have a history of putting traps around their trailer park and befriending tourists only to rob them. Now, this would be the first time that they'd targeted locals, though. The cops told Carson and Sam that we might all be called in for trial and further statements, and I had to give a statement from my hospital bed where I spent 5 excruciatingly boring days. Now, thankfully, we never had to go to court because I guess whatever went down when the cops confronted them far exceeded whatever happened with us. And my guess is something escalated, prison time, and there was a story in the local paper about something similar, but for some reason there were no details of the assailants or any identifying information. Now, we all still live in that Arizona town. We've all made our lives and careers here, and anyone who says that you can't make it if you stay in your hometown is lying. We all do well for ourselves, and we're all still friends to this day. Like I said, Carson's never had to pay for another drink with us again, and Sam gets a few freebies too, because there's always that nagging feeling that maybe he was the one who suggested it in the first place, so he doesn't push back when it's his round. Either way, that was our one and only attempt at dipping our toes into what you might call Urbex. Well, Desert X, I guess. Gaming arcades, bowling, and snowboarding for us going forward, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Yo, Joel, good to finally write in and meet you, kinda. So basically, when I was growing up and in my first year of college, I got dared by my buddies to spend the night in the local haunted cemetery. Woo, spooky. The town I grew up in had a great college, and so I got in there and was able to live at home too. It was a bonus. Growing up, we'd always known that the cemetery attached to St. Augustine's of Christ was haunted. It just had this aura at night, you know? Obviously, all cemeteries are spooky at night, but this one was different. We tried partying there when we were maybe 15 and my brother bought us alcohol. Now, out of 7 of us, boys and girls, not one of us got even a buzz out of the beers, and it was like there was this pressure in the air that I don't really know how to describe it. Have you ever been to a place that just feels bad? You can't explain it, it just does. It has a sort of aura of darkness. Now, I guess I should explain a little about St. Augustine's of Christ, the cemetery, and where exactly it is. It wasn't in our town. It was in a nearby ghost town that had been abandoned in the mid-1800s when the population grew so small thanks to a contaminated well that the remaining townsfolk moved to a bigger town with better job prospects, better community, and obviously better water. And I think after the sickness died off, there were around 5 families left in the town and 2 young widows. You can't blame them for not staying. And now one of the widows worked in the government in some kind of high-up position, and through whatever chicanery, apparently involving the Pinkertons, she managed to set up a deal via her government contacts where the land was sold to a company who were now planning to develop on it. Now, we never did find out what they were planning to develop because the owner disappeared shortly after with the contents of the entire bank account of said institution and probably spent like the last years living it up on a beach somewhere. And so that business folded, but technically they weren't bankrupt or liquidated. I don't know, I'm not some business major, I don't understand all that shiz, but the point is, this town ended up being owned by essentially nobody. Nobody could move in, nobody could develop there, and nobody could do anything except allow it to just fall into ruin. It was maybe a 90-minute drive from our town, but there was really no reason to visit. It was just a bunch of sad, boarded-up houses that reminded us of everything we lost in the early years of medicinal treatment and how everything dies eventually. It's a nice feeling. Now, of course, it would have been a fantastic place for the local kids to go out and party, but none of us want to. And this went back generations, and is still the case to this day as far as I know. The town itself was a little unsafe because there were potential predators in the area, the animal kind, I guess maybe the human kind too. And the cemetery was safer because you could lock up the gates still and have yourself a kegger, but as I said, the one time we tried, it never felt right. The cemetery was kind of on a small hill with the abandoned church at the peak, and none of us even entertained the idea of breaking in or vandalizing the cemetery or the town. It was like, F it. I sound like a moron for saying this, but it was like it was under some kind of protection, and I do not mean from God. It felt cursed. So obviously, when I was new to college and the girl I had a major crush on dared me to spend the night in St. Augustine of Christ Cemetery, I agreed. And she also hinted that she'd be very impressed with me if I did it like I was some kind of hero or something, and that was really enough for me. I mean, it had been 3 years since the ill-fated kegger among the tombstones. I'm sure I'd hyped it up in my mind so it felt worse than it was. I could do this. I could drive there, camp there overnight, maybe grab a couple of sleeping pills from my dealers so I didn't even have to worry about staying up, and then I'd use this disposable camera that I brought to prove that I'd stay there by taking photos of my watch, the sunset, the nighttime, and various bits of proof. I did suggest that someone accompany me, ideally the girl who dared me, to prove that I was on the level, but nobody wanted to do it. And so I sucked it up, and during my little spring break, I drove to the ghost town. I tried not to look at the houses slowly rotting away as I walked to the gates of the cemetery. Now thankfully they were still able to be opened and able to be sealed shut by a metal sliding lock, so no predators would be getting in. Apparently there had been mountain lion sightings about 100 miles away or so, and while that sounded like nothing, I didn't want to risk anything. Plus coyotes had been seen in the area, and okay, I didn't want anyone coming into the cemetery without me being alerted. And that's when I realized the problem with the sleeping pill idea. I brought a couple of super-strength Ambien from my dealer, and as someone who'd never taken Ambien before, I was pretty sure that was just one that would knock me out for the whole night, even if a serial killer broke in and ripped me to shreds. So I left them at home, hidden in the secret compartment of my drawer that I found out years later Mom had always known about. And so I had around 14 hours to kill. The sun hadn't even set yet, and I was getting bored. And I tried to do some reading for school, and that got boring. And then I tried to read a few comics, and even they couldn't keep my attention. I just had this creeping dread around my heart all the time. I snapped awake. I had somehow drifted off to sleep outside the tent on the hard dirt floor, and by now the sun had already set. There was a light breeze coming from the east, and these voices were carried on the breeze. It seemed like there were two female voices, and they were speaking in what I can only describe as like 1800s vernacular. Vague hints about witchcraft and sacrifice and burning people alive. And of course, this made me feel extremely safe, and I was glad that I had my Bowie knife with me at the very least. Then from the other side of the town, more distant sounding than the witchcraft talk, but fighting against the wind, I could hear what sounded like a fire and brimstone preacher. It was the most surreal experience. A preacher with a deep, booming voice quoting Bible passages in the far distance on one side of me, and then two admittedly seductive-sounding women talking like witches on the other. I decided that since I was in some churchyard, the preacher would already be here if this was his stomping grounds, and the witches wouldn't come close. Or it was my friends just trying to freak me out. Now that was the most obvious, most likely, and almost certainly the true answer. I tucked into my tent and hid. Nothing happened for about an hour or so, and then I heard the rusty creaking of the cemetery gate being opened. I didn't think. I literally just noped out of the tent, swinging my knife around, hoping that I could out-crazy whoever was out there. Now I was met by two girls, wearing goth makeup, around my age, who screamed the place down when they saw me. They turned to run when I desperately began calling out that I thought that they were witches, and that I dared to spend the night there, etc., etc. Now one of them turned around and asked if my name was X. Now I'm not going to dox myself here, I'm just using that as a placeholder, and I said that yeah, it was, and that's when I recognized the girls. They actually went to my college, they were freshmen too, and they just didn't normally dress like that. They were kind of normal-looking art students, so I hadn't recognized them in the moment. No, I won't bore you with a lengthy explanation on how we smoothed everything out, but it turns out that they'd come to this ghost town to do a photo shoot for their final project, which was, quote, shameful history. And they told me that the story about the town wasn't quite what we'd heard. In the initial days of the well turning bad, two women had been punished for witchcraft by throwing them down the already deceased well, with claims that they'd cursed the town with some sickness. I'm sure that the two corpses down there really helped, right? Now, this is what they were photographing, posing as the two women and creating some superimposed imagery showing them looking up from the well, trapped down there. And it all sounded really cool and really interesting and thankfully not cursed. Now, I jokingly asked if they wanted to camp with me to help me win the bet, and I genuinely think that they might have said yes if it wasn't for the bad vibes in the place. Now, there was a moment when they hesitated and I thought that I'd hit a home run, but then they said they had to get back and invited me to at least walk them to their car, which was parked around the side of the town. I began to accompany them when we heard the booming footsteps, and then that booming voice rang out and he sounded very close, like he was just around the corner behind us. Now, I can't 100% remember exactly which Bible passages he was quoting, but I've included a few that I'm certain I heard him growl after us. A man or a woman who is a medium or spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them, their blood will be on their own heads. And then a pause as we started to walk quicker, not wanting to run in case it caused the man, who so far was just stomping along, to speed up. Next he said, "Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." Now we started to jog now, and I glanced backwards. This huge man in a long, dusty leather coat was slowly striding towards us. He was barely a silhouette in the darkness, but I could see the white glow of some sort of collar at his throat. Now when he saw me looking at him, he boomed this: "Submit yourself then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you." And finally, as we all broke into a run, the preacher did not seem to speed up at all, and yet he was still getting closer. Now, I remember this quote for definite because it was the last thing he said to us, and it bounced around in my head over the years. "But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, Those who practice magic arts, the adulterers and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death." We reached the girls' car. One of them got behind the wheel and the other dived into the back seat with me, and we just hightailed it out of there. And if the preacher was shouting anything else, I couldn't hear it. But I did look back through the rear window and saw him holding up some old-school crucifix in one hand, or at least shining, sort of, and a Bible in the other, I think. And as we were nearly home, the girls asked if I'd like to come back to their shared apartment to chill out and debrief and maybe even smoke something to calm us down. I said that no, if it was okay, I'd rather just be given a ride home because I was so freaked out that I really wouldn't make for good company in this moment. Now, it was only later that I realized that I'd just rejected 2 hot goth chicks inviting me back to their apartment, but I was always absolutely useless with women, and this was the part my now girlfriend was teasing me about. Now, these days, I am kind of a religious man. I don't camp overnight in cemeteries, and I kind of feel like the preacher was giving me a bit of a warning. I don't know what that warning was, but I know that if he'd caught up with any of us, it would not have been good. I left that town in that state now, but occasionally a buddy tells me a rumor about the ghost town. A crucified body found in the churchyard, but of course I can never find anything about it, like he said, and a group of teens who were scared off by a guy who looked like the Undertaker. Now that one I can believe. I don't know what I encountered that day, but I do know that I go to church every Sunday and pray to God every night, and I think I genuinely believe, and it's not just fear. So whatever that preacher did, or might have done, I think he set my life on the track that I'm happy with, so you might have been out to kill me, but you didn't, and for that, all is forgiven. This event played out in 2001, a few months before everything changed. I lived in Cali and I'd recently gotten heavily into analog photography, and digital was almost unheard of back then and certainly not very good at the time. I've been taking photos of things all around the California desert, really focusing on outdoor sunset shots and things like that. Then I heard about this old ghost town around 5 hours away. If I took a thermos of coffee and started early, I could make it there and back with plenty of time to spend photographing the old ruins. And I saw some photos in a book in the library, and there didn't seem to be any real modern pictures of the place. It had likely rotten to almost nothing now, but that in and of itself was interesting to me. And so I headed out one chilly morning on a day that promised to be hot with a little bit of a breeze, which is a rare treat around here. Now, I don't think I saw a single other vehicle on the drive to the ghost town. Maybe I did and I wasn't paying attention, but I'm usually a pretty attentive person to things like that. Now, I started to revel in the loneliness. Maybe it was silly for me at a then 23-year-old woman to enjoy isolation and being in the middle of nowhere, but hey, my survival instincts had never been very good. Now, eventually I see a pole or two in the distance that signaled the ghost town. I drove off-road and across the sand for as far as I was comfortable with in my old car and then trekked the rest of the way. And the moment I reached the town, I could tell that something just felt wrong. It wasn't just the feeling of wrongness, although that was certainly there, an unpleasant vibe that made me want to just turn tail and run before I'd even begun. But it was what lay around the ruins and foundations of this town that really unsettled me. I'd learned that the town had been abandoned after the gold rush, when there were no more work to be had and the nearby areas had been tapped, so they just sort of upped and let it die. And that sense of death had clearly remained, because scattered around the town were numerous coyote corpses, all in various stages of decay. Now, I could only tell that they were coyotes because the corpse nearest me was, well, fresh. A macabre part of me thought about taking a photograph, but it felt a bit too morbid. I was about to just up and get out of there when something in the center of the main street caught my eye. Someone was lying on the floor, face up, and I had no choice but to approach, and my eyes were darting around in case this was some kind of trap. No, it most definitely wasn't. The guy laying on the desert ground was dead as dead could be. His skin was shriveled to a paper-thin coating, and bones poked through in places where the epidermis had given up the ghost. He had no eyeballs, of course, and empty, abyssal sockets just gazed up at me. The weirdest thing was he dressed in the garb of someone from at least 20 years ago, and this didn't look like some homeless person had just dropped dead here yesterday. It looked like this man had been dead for a couple of decades, and yet he lay almost on top of the sand, barely covered, as if he'd been exhumed for some purpose. Now, I studied a forensic pathology module at college just before dropping out, so I had a little insight into what I was looking at, and I couldn't see any obvious wounds or causes of death. It was almost like he just laid down and died. And instead of the sand covering his body over the subsequent 20 years, just like the coyotes, he was somehow left visible. I headed off quickly and drove straight home, where I called the cops, and they promised to call me back, and a few days later they did. They said that their pathologist agreed with me that he just laid down and died. There was no sign of some heart attack or anything like that. It was almost like his body had just sort of stopped. Now, this can happen sometimes when someone gets really old or really sick, and when I asked if this guy had been sick, I was told that the pathologist hadn't been able to comment on that, as she hadn't found any evidence of anything directly fatal. No hits to the head, no broken bones of any sort. It was all just very strange. I asked about the coyotes, and they said that this was the jurisdiction of the wildlife department, who hadn't told them anything, so that was just another mystery that I never got solved. I kind of wish that no matter how grim it would have been, I had taken photographs of everything after, but it just felt so disrespectful. I really do think that someone just dug that body up and moved it from some graveyard far away. Now, around a decade later, I was driving down the same road for a much lengthier, days-long road trip, and I saw the location where the town had been and the way the wood had rotted even further. I thought about stopping and going over to take another look, but something stopped me. A kind of darkness that gripped my heart, a voice in my head that said no. And I've long since learned that when my instincts tell me not to do something, I should listen. So as far as I know, that town's still out there, and who knows what might find you if you went there today. I know that I, for one, do not want to find out. Imagine, if you will, a quiet country town. During its heyday, from the swinging 60s to the synth-laden 80s, the population fluctuated around the 1,000 mark. That was the population of this specific town in 1980, and by 1990, just a decade later, the population had dropped to just 63 souls living in the, some would say, cursed, town of Centralia. Centralia is perhaps the most famous ghost town of our time, although strictly speaking it's not entirely a ghost town yet. As of now, 5 residents still remain in the town that never stops burning. The reason for Centralia, Pennsylvania's abrupt abandoning is the stuff of nightmares, but the timeline of events is what makes it especially scary. Nobody can agree exactly on what caused the underground fire that caused the anthracite coal beneath the town to begin burning. Some say it was the regular burning of the town dump. Others claim the fire had started the day before, caused by the dumping of hot coal or ash. Some people believe that the fire had actually been burning since 1932, slowly reaching the mines under the town in the 1960s. The local residents knew vaguely that there was a small fire problem with the disused mining tunnels beneath the town, but it wasn't until 1979, 17 years later, that the townsfolk started to discover the severity of the issue. Now imagine this. You've been living above a slow-burning, potentially lethal fire for 17 years. Essentially, you've been living above hell. And in 1981, the first near tragedy hit the town. A 12-year-old kid named Todd fell into a sinkhole, a mere 4 feet wide but 150 feet deep. The hole suddenly opened beneath his feet in his grandmother's backyard. Due to the blast of the heat and sudden disappearance of the ground, the boy must have felt like he was about to be dragged down to Hades itself. Thankfully, Todd managed to grab hold of a tree root, and his cousin had the chance to play the hero by dragging him to safety. The steam from the sinkhole was tested and found to contain lethal levels of carbon monoxide. Even after Todd's near tragedy, townsfolk were divided on how serious the issue actually was. Evidence of the fire under the town grew and grew, as did the bitter resentment and arguing between those who wanted to up sticks and leave and those who weren't prepared to give up their home. But the government put $42 million in the relocation efforts, and eventually nearly all the residents decided having a very real representation of hell beneath their feet wasn't worth the nostalgia. And by 1990, just 63 people remained. By 2010, only 5 homes were left in Centralia. Hundreds of buildings had been demolished and eminent domain had been invoked on all property in the borough. Now, the fire also spread to a nearby town, ironically named Burnsville, which as of today had been completely evacuated. That one's a true